Upstate New York is beautiful, but for teenagers, it can be quiet. Too quiet. So, when 18-year-old Josh Niles meets 16-year-old Charlene Albert, he's ready for anything.
Hey.
Hey.
We meet again. Lucky.
Not that lucky, we just met inside.
Josh met Charlene from a mutual friend that they had together.
You like?
Charlene was very pretty. Charlene was very outgoing. At the time, they both liked going out to like clubs, bars, so they had that in common.
I also lucky because there's not much to do in there. You want to get out of here? You find something better to do?
Sure.
The young couple is soon inseparable.
He would make her dinners, he would take her out to dinner, he would buy her outfits to go to dinner with. He did a lot for her.
He wasn't the gushy type person. He would do things to show you he cared. He didn't always come right out and say it.
And when Charlene's home life hits the rocks, Josh is determined to save her.
Hey. Hey, you okay?
I don't think I can stay in that house anymore.
Her and her mom are hit and miss. Sometimes they love each other, other times they couldn't stand each other.
Maybe you don't have to. Come stay with me at my parents' house.
And that's what she did.
Hey, it's really nice. Your mom's letting me move in.
Well, I shouldn't have much of a choice.
Hey, please be careful.
What the hell's in here? It's really heavy.
My shoes.
How many pairs of shoes you got, woman?
Not nearly enough. Hey, Barb.
Well, I wasn't real thrilled with it because they were young. I thought they should live apart. But Josh always got his way.
Josh works at a local restaurant.
He was a go-getter, so, he was always making money and doing things.
Hey.
Hey. I wish you could come home right now.
Yeah, but if I did, you wouldn't be wearing those shoes.
Charlene liked to shop, and Josh liked to make Charlene happy, so he would make sure she had what she wanted.
Well, but the only bling I want is on my hand. On my feet.
Alright, this is, it's not the place for that conversation. Again.
It's never the right time, Josh.
Charlene was very adamant on getting married.
He thought it was just paper. It didn't mean much. If you wanted to be with someone, you could do it without a marriage certificate.
You can't just keep jerking me around forever.
I'm not jerking you around, Char. But this constant nagging sure as hell doesn't make me want to put a ring on it.
Grow up, Josh!
But after less than a year together, Charlene gets the commitment she wants when the teenagers have a baby girl.
Such a beautiful baby. Yeah, you're so beautiful.
He loved her. She was his world.
Shh, babe, you don't want to wake her up.
Josh was the above and beyond dad.
Is it wrong if I do? I just want to look into her big, beautiful eyes.
The young family soon moves out of his parents' place and into their own. But all is far from perfect.
There were several calls to the sheriff's office and to 911. Some of the complaints were by Charlene that Josh was physically abusive to her, and we had complaints from Josh that Charlene was physically abusive to him.
But Charlene isn't the one who winds up in jail.
When Josh would be arrested, most of the time it would be a couple nights, maybe a week or two, but it was never long periods of time.
Hey.
I'm sorry, Char.
Yeah, you better be.
I don't want to go there again, okay?
Well, I know how you can make it up to me.
Josh and Charlene could not part for the life of them.
I never could figure out why he kept going back.
Josh would go back to Charlene. I think he thought he loved her. I don't know why he thought he loved her. I don't know if what he loved more, going to jail or her.
Psychotherapist Stacy Kaiser and forensic psychologist Brian Russell think the teenaged couple are simply not ready for the challenges ahead.
Josh and Charlene are basically teenagers, just older teenagers. And what we know about teenagers developmentally is they tend to be impulsive. They don't tend to have advanced communication skills or thinking skills. And so I think that's part of what we're seeing here with Josh and Charlene. They love each other, and yet their conflict is intense.
Josh and Charlene are in the midst of a very dangerous, very vicious cycle in which their conflict resolution style seems to be physical altercations. And yet neither one, Charlene nor Josh, has really shown the kind of maturity, the kind of realization of the danger that they're in and that they're putting children in, that really gives me confidence that they're gonna be the rare exception that would be able to do that work successfully.
Despite the fights, within 2 years, Josh and Charlene have another child.
I am just like, Josh, another baby? Are you sure? But yeah, he was ecstatic to have another kid with her.
But something has changed.
Charlene is very different this time around with Bartley. She kind of ignores him.
I fed you and changed you. There is no reason to be crying.
Doesn't pay him much mind, doesn't hug him, kiss him, leaves him in a crib most of the time to scream and cry.
And it's not just the baby who's being ignored.
Charlene starts going out more. It's just getting worse and worse. And she's partying. At this point, Josh is like, you know what? She's gone all the time.
How, Charlene?
It sends Josh right to the edge,
He confronts Charlene with his suspicions.
and there will be no turning back.
He said enough's enough.
Even though young parents Josh Niles and Charlene Albert spend most of their time fighting with each other, their frequent breakups never last. But less than 5 years in, Josh can't shake the ugly thought that Charlene is cheating on him.
How late were you out last night?
Not late.
I changed your baby, it was like 3-something, bed was empty.
I don't know, Josh. Must have been right after that. I lost track of time.
Probably because you were already in bed. Just not ours.
You feel like a big man now, Josh, huh?
Charlene, come on. Charlene, come on, let me in.
The cops got called, he got brought in front of the judge, and the judge said, no more. You gotta do sometime. If you're gonna keep getting called, can't just keep letting you out.
He spent 6 months in jail. And that was the end for Josh. He said enough's enough.
With the relationship finally over, Charlene moves on and out of state.
Charlene moved to Texas. Her mother moved there. So I think she wanted to be closer to her mother.
Bye.
Charlene quickly makes a new life for herself and her kids in Texas, and makes a new beau, Jace.
Jace made very good money, and he treated my niece and nephew with respect.
He did seem like a really good guy.
Jace and Charlene decided to get married, which was quite nice. Thinking, yay, Charlene's married, she'll leave Josh alone completely. Just let him have his visitations, and that'll be that.
Back in New York, Josh finds new love too.
Have I told you how lucky I am?
Not today, but yesterday, and the day before that.
Actually, I want to focus on something else. Something important. Amber Washburn, will you marry me?
Yes.
I think Josh changed his mind with getting married because he finally knew what love was.
Ready?
Yeah.
But down in Texas, the news strikes a nerve.
Charlene would be on social media always discrediting my brother, saying he's a horrible father, he's an abuser, just would get into a Charlene mood and start trash talking Josh. I think she was jealous of Josh.
Charlene has a history of posting things on social media about everyone.
The opposite of love is actually indifference. And what we're seeing here in the relationship with Charlene and Josh is that Charlene is filled with hatred. And that tells me she is still connected to him in some way. And so she still wants to hurt him. And that's what she's doing by trashing him on social media, by continuing to fight with him. It's almost like her way of continuing to still get a Josh fix and have some kind of connection to him.
And so you have to ask yourself, why? Why is she doing that? She's married herself. So why would him getting married be bothersome to her? And I think it harkens probably all the way back to the fact that at the beginning she wanted to get married, he didn't. And here he is seeming like, well, he doesn't have any problem marrying this woman. There's an insult in this to Charlene.
And the insults just keep on coming.
It wasn't very civil.
Josh was sick of it. He was fed up with, having to battle this out.
After Josh Niles and Charlene Childers split up and start new families, the fights between them quiet down. It might be because Charlene's life in Texas is shaping up nicely. New husband, new home, new job.
She was involved in some sort of either animal rescue or animal control in Texas.
But this new job is about to change her life entirely when she meets one of the local cops.
Yeah, this is okay?
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. I'm Tim Dean.
Timothy Dean was the chief of police of a small town in Texas up in the Panhandle called Sunray.
Charlene.
Nice to meet you. I've actually seen you around.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Would you like to grab a drink with me tonight?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah. Which way are you?
That way.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
I don't know what her thing was with men.
For whatever reason, they come to her and they will do whatever for her.
A mere month after Charlene starts her new job, she leaves her husband for Tim.
Jace expressed that the reason that their relationship kind of went south was because he couldn't really hold her down. She was a sexually motivated individual.
Things with Tim get serious quickly.
I don't know what to say.
Put it on.
Charlene divorces Jace, but she is conflicted.
She's supposed to be marrying Tim, but she was still talking to Jace.
The night before she was married to Tim, they were together. The night after their honeymoon, they were together.
To make things even more complicated, Tim has a child of his own, in addition to Charlene's two.
What are you waiting for? Eat your food.
And his parenting style is very different from hers.
Eat! I said eat it. Eat your damn food!
May of 2018, Charlene decided to videotape her stepdaughter.
No, I don't want to hear whimpering or whining. I want to hear yes, sir.
So Tim is yelling at this little girl.
Eat!
And videotapes Tim slap his daughter in the face.
And she had forwarded that to 3 people. One of those people took that to the authorities, where the investigation commenced.
And actually, Josh was already on his way driving to Texas to pick up his children when CPS called him.
Child Protective Services.
And CPS said, you need to get here and come get your kids. And he didn't know anything about this incident up until then. He's like, well, I'm already on my way to get them. Well, no, you need to get here now, otherwise they're gonna end up in the system.
Okay, yeah, I'm on my way right now, okay? I'll be there as soon as possible.
Tim ends up in the system too.
They conduct the investigation, and subsequently he is arrested for the child abuse. He has to leave his position as the chief of police.
Charlene doesn't get off scot-free either.
Josh was granted temporary custody because, of course, Charlene was the one that had videotaped Tim smacking his child.
Despite this, Charlene stands by Tim. To her, there's only one villain in this story.
This is not over, Josh.
I look at Charlene and I see her as a person who does not take responsibility for her own behaviors.
I don't believe that there was anything accidental or coincidental about Charlene videotaping Tim abusing the child and releasing the videotape to other people who ended up reporting the abuse. I think she set it up. I think she had a plan. I think the plan probably involved giving herself leverage over Tim, knowing how devastating that could be to his career.
What it tells me is she needs something from him. There's still something we're waiting to find out.
With Charlene in Texas and Josh in New York, the battle heats up.
I think that Josh was sick of it. He was fed up with, having to battle this out. And the things that went down in Texas, he wasn't happy about. They were living their best lives up here in New York.
But that is all about to change.
Hey! What are you guys doing today?
I'm heading to Niagara Falls for your brother's birthday.
I wish you can come.
He goes, well, I wish I could go with you, but I'm going to have to get the kids off the bus. But you and Dad can stop by before you go up if you'd like.
Have a good trip, all right?
And I'm like, if we stop at Josh's, that's going to take up another hour or two from us getting to Niagara Falls. I really don't want to stop.
Later that day, his sister Nicole hears disturbing news about his kid's school.
I got home and I sat down, got on social media, started looking through, and I noticed that the Sodas school was in a lockdown. So I'm like, I wonder why Sodas is in a lockdown. And I start reading comments. Somebody has been shot. A woman has been shot, and the neighbor across the street had been shot. So I text my brother Amber and see what's going on. So I text Josh and I said, hey Josh, there's a shooting in Sodas and the school's in a lockdown. Are the kids okay? Are you okay? What's going on?
We had stopped on the thruway to get something to eat. And I get a text from Nicole, and she goes, Mom, have you talked to Josh today? And I kept calling him, and he wasn't answering.
Hey, can't come to the phone right now.
You know what to do?
So I started calling Amber's phone. She wasn't answering. And I'm feeling sick. And the last message I sent Josh, I just said, Joshua. Because he knew when I called him that meant, you better call me. And I got a phone call, and it was an unknown private number, and I just knew. I just remember screaming, no, not my Josh. Not my Josh. And she told me that he was not alive. And I said, what about Amber? And she said Amber was gone too.
Who would do this to my brother?
With this devastating news, fear grips the community and the family.
I'm trying to find my kids.
We didn't know if our family was in danger.
They haven't caught the person, and maybe they can come after one of us.
The small community of Sodus, New York is in lockdown. Locals Josh Niles and his fiancée Amber Washburn have been gunned down in broad daylight by an unknown assailant.
We immediately did a reverse 911 call to the neighborhood to advise everyone to shelter in place. The school was immediately put into lockdown. We found approximately 13 spent cartridges. Josh was hit 9 or 10 times. While Amber Washburn was still located in her car, my first thoughts was that it would take some experience for someone to use a handgun to shoot her and shoot her in the head through a car window. I do not believe a novice gun owner would be able to do that. It was pretty apparent to us that it was emotionally driven because of the amount of times that whoever did this had shot him. So whoever did this had a lot of anger towards Josh.
As investigators process the crime scene, a frantic Charlene reaches out from Texas.
Yeah, I just heard about a shooting. I'm trying to find my kids.
Charlene contacted us pretty soon after the incident had happened. She had called the school several times with concerns about her children's safety. She told us that she had seen a picture of the house that was involved in the shooting. I let her know what was going on with her children.
Not to worry, ma'am. The children are safe. They're with their Aunt Nicole.
Okay, perfect. Great, I'll be there as soon as I can. Thank you.
She responded that she would certainly help out.
Police canvass the neighborhood.
The neighbor directly next door to Josh Niles' home, she heard them talking or conversing out in the driveway.
So, you were right here when it happened. What did you see?
I saw my neighbor talking to a man in a hoodie.
You're not going anywhere near my kids, right? Get off this property!
He looked really upset, like not okay. Then I heard a pop and I saw him grabbing his chest.
Josh was trying to get away from the shooter. He was crawling under his car. And at the same time, he's screaming for Amber. Amber! She saw Josh get shot. She put the car in reverse. But she didn't even have a chance to step on the gas to get out of there.
In less than a day, Charlene is back in Sodus and heads straight to her lawyer's office to regain custody of her children.
I contacted her by phone, and she was in her family court attorney's office, and we discussed her coming to meet with me.
Milby,
And later on that afternoon, I got another phone call from her family court attorney that said that she wasn't going to be responding, that she had told me everything she needed to tell me, and didn't feel that anything else that she had would be worthy of my investigation.
Meanwhile, the families hold a vigil for the slain couple.
It was in Josh and Amber's front yard, and there was a bunch of people with candles and flowers just standing around talking about Josh and Amber and who could do this to them.
It made us feel good that people were mourning the loss of Josh and Amber with us and praying that the people or person at that time we didn't know would be caught.
Soon there's a familiar voice calling loudly for justice.
Charlene came to the vigil. Of course she came to the vigil. It's her children's father. She wants to support her children. She made a quite bold statement, told news reporters,
"My kids are gonna grow up without a dad because of this. And I'm not gonna rest until justice is served."
Charlene is not there alone.
She had her boyfriend at the vigil with her.
But it's not Tim Dean.
So Charlene, she had been with Kyle Muller before. When she was younger, Charlene's mother had Kyle arrested for statutory rape because Charlene was underage at that time. Yet he went with her again.
We pretty quickly interviewed the boyfriend, and he was alibied. He was at work at the time of the shooting.
Charlene shows up at Josh's memorial service with this new boyfriend, and no one could be surprised by that. This is her pattern. She moves from guy to guy to guy.
Charlene is thinking about Charlene. And in her mind, the number one focus is not about what everyone else is thinking related to Josh. It's about what everyone else is thinking related to her children. And I believe she's trying to present the illusion or the truth that she is no longer with Tim and that she is a safe parent for those two kids so that she can get them back.
With no clear suspects, suspicion keeps drifting back to Charlene. But she was 1,700 miles away.
Then the next logical person to look at would be the person who caused her to lose custody of her children.
Tim Dean.
Well, we contacted our brothers in law enforcement in Texas, and they were familiar with him. And we found out pretty quickly that Tim Dean had been into a motor vehicle accident in Kansas 2 days before the murder.
Timothy Dean was lost apparently on some backcountry road, and he needed to turn around, and he hit a culvert, hit it hard enough that this car was totaled. His rental car was totaled.
But what is Tim Dean doing in Kansas?
The Kansas deputy actually sent us a copy of his body-worn camera so that we could view the entire interaction between him and Tim Dean. And it was during that interaction that Tim Dean divulged that he was on his way to New York to visit a friend.
And he told this police officer in Kansas,
"Where are you going?" Honestly, man, I was just driving. My whole life has kind of gone to lately. We have a pending divorce and all that fun stuff.
Is there anything in there I need to know about?
Nah.
Okay.
I've got a shotgun in there, but nothing illegal.
and he mentioned something about maybe killing himself.
He's got a firearm on him. Concealed carry.
A shotgun, an AR-15, more than one sidearm, ballistic armor, and ammunition. Well, in Kansas, that didn't ring any bells with the deputy. It's fairly normal for people to have tactical gear or sidearms.
Getting a divorce from Texas, just out driving around. Thought he might go to New York.
From Texas?
Yeah.
What the hell's he doing here?
Things weren't adding up.
Including the name on the totaled first rental vehicle.
Timothy Dean wasn't the one on the paperwork. He wasn't the one that signed for this car.
The initial car that was rented in Texas was rented by another individual, Bron Bowler.
Who's Bowler Brown?
He's a buddy of mine.
Bron Bowler was a police officer for Sunray PD. It turned out that Tim Dean tried to rent another car, but he couldn't do so because he only had cash.
Police are astonished to find out who did rent the second car.
Charlene Childers drove to Kansas to rent the vehicle in Wichita.
In police work, we call that a clue.
The police are even more shocked when they find out where Tim was going exactly.
Some of the electronic surveillance that we were able to discover did track Tim Dean, and we've got him on video within the village of Sodas.
He's even on Josh and Amber's street.
We have Tim Dean as early as 7 o'clock surveilling the town. He was actually casing the Niles residence, was walking through town.
As the damning evidence mounts, Detective Milby decides it's time to go to the source.
5 of us piled into a couple of cars and we decided to go to Texas.
Tim Dean is arrested, but not for murder.
The Texas authorities still had pending charges for another child protective investigation. His arrest for local charges allowed us to keep his whereabouts known to us while we continued our investigation.
Had you ever met him in person?
I'd been there when he'd come to get the kids.
Is it true you hated Josh?
I never even met the man. If you think I'm gonna sit here and say that I did that, you're crazy.
Meanwhile, back in New York, Charlene is also brought in.
The exact words that were said to her was, your husband has been arrested in Texas. We need you to come to the office with us. And she did.
Honestly, I haven't talked to him. We're getting a divorce, so I kind of have no idea where he is or what he's doing.
Charlene told us that she was divorcing her husband and that her life had moved on without Tim Dean. She had no idea what his comings and goings were.
But if she doesn't know why Tim was in New York, who does?
Braun helps shed the light on that one.
I would do anything for anybody.
Braun portrayed himself as someone who would do anything for a friend.
After Amber Washburn and Josh Niles are gunned down, police follow the evidence straight to Josh's ex-wife, Charlene Childers, and her husband, Tim Dean. Police keep the pressure on Charlene by giving her some startling news.
We found out that Tim Dean had shut his phone off as soon as he got outside of Kansas City and didn't turn it back on until sometime later, again outside Kansas City. Once Tim Dean turned his phone back on, his first phone call was to Charlene, and that lasted just over 1,000 seconds.
That's 16 minutes on the day of her ex-husband's murder.
Okay, yeah. Tim and I talked about that stupid custody battle with Josh. He was abusive, by the way. Tim said something like it would be better if Josh was dead, but I don't think he actually meant it, right? I mean, people say stuff like that all the time, like I wish he was dead. They don't actually do it.
Back in Texas, police are also applying the pressure to Braun Bowler.
Braun, he's asked to come in and give his full accounting of what had happened again. And he stuck to his original story.
Which is that he rented the car for Tim Dean as a favor. Immediately afterwards, he's given a polygraph.
You rented a car for Tim.
Yes, sir.
Dean and Charlie never mentioned anything to you that he needed the car to go on a long trip, visit friends, family, nothing like that?
No, sir.
He needed it for work.
Yes, sir.
So I'm going to ask you, regarding your involvement in the conspiracy to kill Charlie's ex, do you intend to tell the truth?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And it's discovered he lied.
As far as did you give Dean a gun? You failed that question.
After the polygraph, they re-interviewed him and asked him the same questions, such as, did you know what happened? Were you part of the planning process? And were you involved in the conspiracy to commit murder?
Braun has a decision to make, whether he wants to be a good witness or he wants to be charged in conspiracy to commit 2 murders.
You definitely don't want that.
And after he failed the polygraph, he admitted to all of those.
Police learned the plan was as simple as it was brutal. Kill Josh and bring Charlene's kids back.
This plan was discussed between Braun and Charlene and Tim while they were all together in the Dean garage. Braun Bowler was in uniform. Braun Bowler was on duty.
I can't have any connection to this on paper. Hey, look, I'm the first person they're gonna look at.
There was a plan between Charlene and Tim early on to make it look to authorities that they were going to get a divorce. They involved Braun Bowler so that their names wouldn't be detected on either the rental agreements or any other way to New York.
I was just trying to be a good friend to Dean. You know, and I would do anything for anybody.
Braun's just gullible. He portrayed himself as someone who would do anything for a friend.
What happened?
But no one anticipates the fender bender in Kansas.
Tim didn't take any credit cards with him. He only took cash with him, which is why he had a problem in Kansas.
When Tim Dean finally arrives in Sodus, he spends the day on Josh Niles' street.
He cased the Niles residence for quite a while during that day.
Hey, what are you guys doing today?
I'm heading to Niagara Falls for your brother's birthday.
Oh, I wish I could come.
He waited until Josh was alone in his driveway, and then he approached Josh.
All right, bye. What the hell are you doing here?
Shut up.
You're not getting close to my kids, right? So you better get off my property right now.
That's not what this is about.
Oh my God!
Amber!
Braun Bowler's story is enough for police.
Charlene holds out for quite a while in dealing with her charges and doesn't believe that we are actually going to charge her with the murders. Her wheels start turning and she starts thinking about making a deal for herself.
We sat down and we planned it. And Braun rented the car for Tim as a favor. But we never meant to hurt Amber. Okay, that was an accident.
In court, Charlene Childers testifies against Tim Dean, admitting that while she planned the murder, he pulled the trigger.
So Charlene took a plea deal. Charlene got 28 years in prison with 5 years of probation. Timothy, he's gone. He is going to try to get appeals, but Timothy is gone for life.
Braun Bowler is sentenced to 5 years for conspiracy to commit murder.
I believe justice was served 2/3 of the case. I believe Braun Bowler got one hell of a deal. There was never any sign of remorse in Tim Dean. Charlene showed a little bit of remorse. Charlene is a very dangerous woman. She's a very calculated woman. Hopefully, she'll be too old to use that charisma again by the time she gets out of prison.
The hardest part of this all for me, honestly, is that my sister was never a part of the plan.
Unfortunately for Amber Washburn, that had she been a minute earlier or a minute later, she probably would still be alive.
Some people may wonder why Charlene just didn't divorce Tim and then try to get custody back of her kids to Texas. Charlene might have not been able to succeed, so by killing Josh, Charlene ensured that Josh would not be available as an option for the kids to live with.
Charlene has experienced Josh as a complication and hassle all along. She has profiled him as a terrible person, and in her time of stress with Tim and the abuse, he got the kids. And so I believe that Charlene decided she needed to get rid of Josh once and for all. She needed to make sure that he wasn't going to be an obstacle in any way in the future between her and her kids. It's completely possible that Tim killing Josh was what I would call a redemption killing. That he was trying to redeem himself and his relationship when it came to Charlene. You know, he's lost everything. He lost his job, he's in trouble with the law, he has lost his child. The one thing he has left is Charlene, and she is such a master manipulator. I wouldn't put it past her to have said to him, you know what, we're gonna be okay, but you owe me because it's your fault that I lost my kids, and so you're gonna help me get them back. And the only insurance policy for me getting those kids back is you killing my ex.
Charlene's children now live with Josh's sister, Nicole.
Sometimes something happens or I see something, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna text Josh and tell Josh, oh, that's right, I can't. Charlene had him murdered. And in my situation, it's a little bit different because like my mom can scream and yell and curse our name and hate her. Same thing with my siblings. I can't. I have their children. I have to be Charlene friendly in my home.
Miss everything about him. He truly was growing up to be a wonderful man. Just miss him terribly.
The streetlights of Oak Haven didn't flicker. They stood like silent, amber sentinels over a neighborhood that believed in the illusion of safety. It was October 12th, 1984. The air was crisp, smelling of damp leaves and the faint, metallic tang of coming rain. 12-year-old Sarah Miller was 3 minutes away from her front door. She was pedaling her Schwinn bicycle, the chrome fenders catching the rhythmic pulse of the neighborhood lamps. A normal Tuesday, a mundane commute, but in the span of a single heartbeat, the rhythm broke. The bicycle was found 10 minutes later, its front wheel still spinning, whispering against the asphalt of an empty cul-de-sac. No scream, no struggle, just a half-eaten apple in the grass and a silence, so heavy it seemed to swallow the very sound of the crickets. The town of Oak Haven didn't know it yet, but the clock had just stopped. For the next 40 years, that spinning wheel would become the symbol of a community frozen in time, a ghost story told in hushed tones behind locked doors, a wound that refused to scab over. This wasn't just a disappearance. It was a vanishing act that defied logic, a void where a child used to be, leaving behind a trail that grew colder with every falling leaf, until the name Sarah Miller became synonymous with the dark. The sirens that tore through the night weren't just loud. They were frantic, a jagged blade cutting through the suburban peace. Within an hour, the woods behind the Miller estate were a sea of flashlights, frantic beams of white light dancing through the oak trees like nervous fireflies. Every neighbor was out. Every basement was searched. Every trunk was popped. The local police, more used to breaking up teenage parties and hunting for a predator, moved with a desperation that bordered on panic. Detective Jim Miller, no relation to Sarah, though he would later say he felt like her father, stood by the abandoned bike. He didn't see a crime scene. He saw a vacuum. There were no skid marks, no blood, no signs of a fight. It was as if Sarah had simply been erased from the physical world. The cold case label wasn't a choice. It was an inevitability that began the moment the sun rose the next morning on an empty bed. The community's shock turned into a localized paranoia. Parents clutched their children tighter. Doors that had never been locked were suddenly bolted with reinforced steel. The news headlines were a drumbeat of terror. Oak Haven's nightmare. The girl who disappeared into thin air. Where's Sarah? The mystery wasn't just about a missing person. It was about the sudden realization that the monster wasn't under the bed. It was walking among them, breathing the same autumn air. The first year was a blur of false leads and shattered hopes. They looked at the man in the tan van, a local legend that turned out to be a harmless delivery driver. They looked at the school janitor, a man whose only crime was his reclusive nature. They even looked at Sarah's own father, a man whose grief was so profound it looked like guilt to the untrained eye. Every tip was a dead end. Every psychic who called the hotline was a vulture circling a tragedy. The investigation was a labyrinth with no center. The 1980s were a different era, a time before GPS, before ubiquitous surveillance, before the digital footprint we all leave behind today. In 1984, you could disappear if you knew where the shadows were deepest. The police files grew thick, bulging with black and white photos of grainy faces and handwritten notes that led to nowhere. The Manhoy KY La, the strange clues, were maddeningly sparse. A single blue thread caught on a branch. A footprint that belonged to a common work boot. Nothing that could hold up in court. Nothing that could bring Sarah home. The case began to settle like dust, layer upon layer of frustration, burying the truth under the weight of passing months. As the years bled into a decade, the media moved on to the next tragedy, but Oak Haven never did. Sarah's bedroom became a museum, a time capsule of 1984. The posters of pop stars grew yellow and curled at the edges. Her dolls stared blankly at a door that never opened. Her mother, Martha, became a fixture at the local precinct, a ghost haunting the hallways, asking the same question every week for 10 years. Is there anything new? The detectives changed, the technology shifted, but the answer remained a crushing no. By 1994, the case was officially cold. The files were moved to the basement, tucked away in a cardboard box labeled with a permanent marker that was slowly fading. This was the era of the SOC Tsongdong, the community shock, transforming into a dull, aching scar. People moved away to escape the memory. New families moved in, unaware that the quiet street they now lived on was once the site of a disappearance that broke a town's soul. But for those who remained, every time a floorboard creaked or a car slowed down near a child, the memory of Sarah Miller would surge back, a cold tide of what if. The turn of the millennium brought new tools but the same old silence. In 2004, the 20th anniversary, a local news station ran a retrospective. They interviewed Detective Jim Miller, now retired, his hair white, his eyes weary. He sat in his study, surrounded by the same boxes he had taken home from the station. He couldn't let go. He spoke of the man moi beau NGO, the open-ended clues that kept him awake at night. He mentioned a car seen near the cul-de-sac that night, a dark sedan with a mismatched door, a detail that had been buried in the original reports. But 20 years is a lifetime. People die. Memories fray like old rope. The dark sedan was a phantom. Forensic science had advanced. DNA was now the gold standard, but there was no DNA to test. No body had ever been found. No weapon. No clothes. Only that blue thread, which was too small for the technology of the early 2000s to process without destroying it. The case wasn't just cold. It was frozen in a block of ice that refused to melt, even as the world around it burned with new information and digital connectivity. By 2014, 30 years had passed. The Miller parents were gone, Martha dying of what the neighbors called a broken heart, and her husband following soon after. The house was sold, the museum dismantled, the 1984 posters thrown into a dumpster. It seemed like the end of the story. Sarah Miller was now a footnote in a textbook on unsolved crimes. The cold case was a legend, a cautionary tale told to children who hadn't even been born when she vanished. But in the shadows of the digital age, a new kind of hunter was emerging. Online sleuths, armed with scanners and archives, began to piece together the fragments of the Oak Haven mystery. They cross-referenced old newspaper clippings with missing persons databases from across the country. They debated the man in the tan van on forums. They kept the fire flickering, even if it was just a tiny digital spark. They didn't have badges, but they had time, and a collective obsession that the police force, hampered by budgets and new crimes, simply couldn't afford. The mystery was no longer local. It was global, a puzzle being solved by thousands of eyes across the internet. The breakthrough didn't come from a confession or a sudden discovery of remains. It came from a vial of spit and a family tree. In 2024, 40 years after Sarah disappeared, a young woman in a different state uploaded her DNA to a popular genealogy website, hoping to find her biological father. She didn't find him, but the algorithm found something else. It found a partial match to a microscopic sample of skin cells recovered from the handlebars of Sarah's bike, a sample that had been preserved in a vacuum-sealed evidence bag since 1984. The science of ghosts had finally arrived. Forensic genetic genealogy, the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer, was applied to the Oak Haven case. Investigators didn't look for the killer. They looked for his relatives. They mapped out a sprawling tree of cousins, second cousins, and great-aunts. They narrowed it down to a single branch, a family that had lived 3 blocks away from the Millers in 1984, a family with 3 sons. 2 had died years ago. 1 was still alive. His name was Arthur Penhaligon. In 1984, he was a 24-year-old mechanic, a man described as quiet and unassuming. He had never been a suspect. He didn't drive a tan van or a dark sedan. He drove a motorcycle. He had moved away 6 months after the disappearance, settling in a quiet coastal town 300 miles away. When the police knocked on his door in 2024, they didn't find a monster. They found an old man in a cardigan, sitting on a porch, watching the waves. The Matt Titchbean was about to meet its resolution. But the resolution wasn't a Hollywood explosion. It was a whimper. As the detectives showed him the photo of Sarah Miller, the 40-year-old mask finally cracked. He didn't deny it. He didn't fight. He looked at the photo and said, "I've been waiting for you to find her." The shock wasn't that he did it. The shock was that he had lived a full, mundane life while Sarah's family had withered in the shadow of his crime. The interrogation lasted 14 hours. Penhaligon spoke in a low, monotone voice, describing the man-moi KY law that had haunted him for 4 decades. He described how he hadn't planned it. He had just been angry, a young man with a dark void in his chest, and she was there, a flash of chrome in the twilight. He told them where she was. Not in the woods, not in a shallow grave. He had taken her to an old, abandoned well on the edge of the county line, a place that had been paved over by a shopping mall in the late 90s. The realization was a physical blow to the investigators. For 30 years, people had walked over Sarah's resting place, carrying groceries, laughing, oblivious to the child beneath the concrete. The solved status of the case didn't bring joy. It brought a fresh wave of horror. The 40-year cold case was no longer a mystery, but the truth was more agonizing than the silence. The community was SOC all over again, forced to reckon with the fact that the boogeyman had been their neighbor, a man who had helped them jumpstart their cars and waved at them from his porch. The recovery took weeks. They had to cut through layers of asphalt and rebar deep into the earth, while the media watched from behind yellow tape. When they finally found her, she was still wearing her 1984 denim jacket. In her pocket was a friendship bracelet she had made for her mother. The Duum Qua Vu on. The echoes of the crime were deafening. The trial was short. Penhaligon pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, a final act of cowardice that left the community feeling cheated of true justice. He died in his cell 6 months later, taking the full details of Sarah's final moments with him. The case was closed, the file stamped solved in bold red ink, but the air in Oak Haven still felt heavy. The mall was eventually torn down, replaced by a memorial park where a bronze statue of a girl on a bicycle now stands. The front wheel doesn't spin anymore. It is fixed in place, a permanent reminder of the day the music stopped. Justice is a cold comfort when it takes 40 years to arrive. The tragedy of Sarah Miller wasn't just her death. It was the stolen decades of the people she left behind. It was the 40 years of birthdays she never had, the 40 years of grief her parents carried to their graves, and the 40 years of freedom a killer enjoyed. As the sun sets over the memorial park, the amber streetlights flicker on, one by one. They no longer guard an illusion of safety. They illuminate a scar. The 40-year cold case solved headlines have faded from the digital front pages, replaced by newer, fresher horrors. But in the quiet corners of Oak Haven, the mystery hasn't truly ended. It has just changed shape. It is no longer a question of who or where, but why. A question that no DNA test, no confession, and no amount of time can ever truly answer. The ghost of Sarah Miller is finally at rest, but the silence she left behind still speaks to anyone who walks past that bronze bicycle in the fading light. The case is closed, but the haunting remains, a permanent part of the town's DNA, a reminder that the past is never truly gone. It's just waiting for the light to catch it. The clock on the wall of the Oak Haven police precinct was a heavy, circular beast that clicked with a sharp, metallic snap every 60 seconds. A sound that, in the suffocating silence of that first night, felt like a hammer driving a nail into the heart of the town. It was 11:42 p.m., October 12, 1984. Sarah Miller had been missing for precisely 4 hours and 12 minutes. In the brutal mathematics of child abductions, this was the danger zone, the window where the trail is still warm enough to burn, yet the shadows are growing impossibly long. Detective Jim Miller didn't look at the clock. He looked at the map pinned to the corkboard, a web of red string and black ink that traced the final known movements of a 12-year-old girl who had effectively vanished into a crack in the universe. He didn't see streets or avenues. He saw a grid of failures. He saw the dense, suffocating blackness of the Oak Haven woods creeping toward the residential lines, a tidal wave of timber and thorns that seemed to have swallowed the light of her Schwinn bicycle. The air in the room was thick, a pressurized chamber of stale tobacco, ozone from the humming police radios, and the primal, metallic scent of cold sweat panic. The golden hour was dead. The easy answers had evaporated with the sunset. This was the beginning of the long wait, the beginning of the 40-year silence that would eventually define a generation of local law enforcement as the men who let a ghost slip through their fingers. Every officer on the force was on the street, but the street was giving nothing back. The asphalt of the cul-de-sac where the bike was found was cold, indifferent. Forensic science in 1984 was a primitive religion compared to the digital sorcery of the future. There were no high-definition street cameras to scrub through, no GPS pings to track, no digital footprints to follow into the dark. There was only the physical world, the dirt, the grass, and the lingering smell of rain. Jim Miller ran his fingers over the Polaroid of the bicycle. The front wheel had been spinning when they found it, a detail that haunted his sleep for decades. It meant the abduction was surgical. It meant the predator hadn't just been passing through. He had been positioned, weighted, and struck with the precision of a trapdoor spider. There were no skid marks from a car, which suggested the vehicle, if there was one, had been idling, or perhaps the attacker was on foot, hidden in the tree line that hugged the road like a jagged throat. The Manmwa KY law wasn't what they found, but what they didn't. No struggle, no torn clothing, no dropped school books, just a half-eaten apple, its white flesh already browning in the night air. A ticking clock of organic decay that mirrored the fading hope in the precinct. By 2 a.m., the civilian search parties had swelled into a disorganized, frantic army of flashlights. Hundreds of neighbors, fueled by coffee and a terrifying realization that their own children were sleeping just a few thin walls away from a monster, tore through the underbrush of the Oak Haven perimeter. The woods were a cacophony of shouted names. Sarah, Sarah, a chorus of desperation that the wind seemed to catch and throw back at them with mocking echoes. Jim Miller watched them from the edge of the tree line, his heavy mag light cutting a brutal path through the oak and maple. He knew the statistics. He knew that if a child isn't found in the first 6 hours, the search often transitions from a rescue to a recovery. But he couldn't say that to the father, Thomas Miller, who was clawing at the briars with his bare hands until his knuckles were raw and weeping red. The SOC Songdong was already setting in, a collective trauma that manifested as a frantic, buzzing energy. People weren't just looking for Sarah. They were looking for the safety they had lost 10 minutes after the sun went down. They were looking for the world where a girl could ride her bike 3 minutes from home without being erased. The first person of interest emerged not from a lead, but from the town's inherent need to point a finger at the other. His name was Elias Thorne, the night janitor at Oak Haven Middle School. He was a man of shadows, a man who lived in a basement apartment and spoke in sentences that never quite finished. In the fever dream of that first night, Elias became the focal point of the town's rage. Someone remembered seeing his rusted brown pickup truck near the park. Someone else claimed he looked at the girls wrong during recess. Jim Miller didn't believe in coincidences, but he also didn't believe in lynch mobs. He brought Thorne in at 4 a.m. The interrogation room was a concrete box that amplified the sound of the man's ragged breathing. Thorne's hands were stained with industrial floor wax and nicotine, but they weren't shaking. He had an alibi, a television schedule, and a neighbor who saw him taking out the trash. But in 1984, an alibi was only as good as the man giving it. The detectives pushed, they leaned in, they used the good cop, bad cop routine until the air in the room felt like it would combust. But Thorne held firm. He was just a lonely man in a lonely town. He wasn't a monster. The man-moi was a dead end, a flicker of light that turned out to be a reflection in a mirror. As the first gray light of Wednesday morning began to bleed through the clouds, the energy of the search shifted. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching exhaustion. The flashlights were dimming. The voices were hoarse. The woods, which had seemed so sinister in the dark, now just looked indifferent, a vast, tangled mess of gray and brown that held its secrets with a stoic, leafy silence. Jim Miller walked back to the cul-de-sac. He stood exactly where the bike had been. He closed his eyes and tried to hear the sounds of 1984, the distant hum of the highway, the rustle of a squirrel, the wind in the oaks. He tried to visualize the cold case before it earned the name. He imagined a car door opening, a hand reaching out, a brief, muffled scuffle, or perhaps a voice she recognized. That was the thought that made his blood turn to slush. If Sarah didn't scream, did she know her killer? Was the predator not a stranger in a tan van, but a face from the grocery store, a man who pumped gas at the station, a good neighbor who was currently out in the woods with a flashlight, calling her name louder than anyone else? The morning newspapers were already being printed. The headlines were jagged and black. Vanished, Oak Haven girl missing, a parent's nightmare. The photos of Sarah Miller, the school portrait where she had a slight gap in her front teeth and a ribbon in her hair, were being taped to every telephone pole and storefront within a 50-mile radius. It was a Matt Titchby, and that was rapidly becoming a national story. The FBI was called in, their suits and professional detachment a sharp contrast to the raw, bleeding emotion of the local cops. They brought in profilers, men who talked about victimology and predatory patterns, but even they seemed stumped by the absolute lack of physical evidence. No blood, no struggle. It was as if Sarah had been lifted straight up into the sky. The detectives began a door-to-door canvass that would eventually cover 4,000 homes. They asked about strange cars, about new faces, about anything that felt off. But Oak Haven was a town of routine, and on October 12th, the routine had been perfect right up until the moment it wasn't. By the 48-hour mark, the cold case was already beginning to congeal. The initial surge of tips, hundreds of them, were mostly garbage. People seeing Sarah in diners 3 states away. People claiming they saw a UFO over the woods. People wanting to be part of the tragedy. Every lead had to be chased. Every ghost followed to its grave, and every time, the result was a crushing 0. Jim Miller sat at his desk, staring at a stack of witness statements that reached his chin. He felt the weight of the girl's life in those papers. He felt the ticking of that wall clock in his bones. He knew that with every passing hour, the chances of finding Sarah alive were dropping into the single digits. The SOC Song Dong was turning into a quiet, simmering dread. The playground at the elementary school was empty. The bike racks were deserted. The town had locked its windows, but the fear was already inside, sitting at the dinner table, watching the news. Then came the first real man-moi ky la, the blue thread. It was found by a canine unit, snagged on a low-hanging branch 3 miles deep into the northern woods, far beyond where the civilian searchers had reached. It was a tiny, synthetic fiber of a vibrant shade of cerulean that didn't match anything Sarah had been wearing. It was a foreign object in a natural world. For a moment, the precinct held its breath. This was it, the physical link, the breadcrumb. They bagged it, they tagged it, and they sent it to the state lab with a rush order that meant nothing in an era where rush still took weeks. Jim Miller looked at the map. The location of the thread was near an old logging road, a path that had been overgrown for 20 years. If the killer had gone that way, he knew the terrain. He wasn't a drifter. He was a local. The realization was a cold shiver down the spine of the investigation. The monster wasn't coming from the outside. He was already home. He was a part of the landscape, as much a fixture of Oakhaven as the oak trees themselves. But as the days turned into a week, even the blue thread began to lose its luster. The lab report came back inconclusive. The fiber was from a common type of windbreaker sold in thousands of stores across the Midwest. It could belong to anyone. It could have been there for months. The Manwa boat NGO was just another dead end in a labyrinth of failures. The search in the northern woods turned up nothing. No disturbed earth, no hidden camps, no sign of a 12-year-old girl. The silence of the woods was absolute. The silence of the town was worse. The Millers had stopped answering their door. The lights in their house stayed on all night, every night, a desperate beacon for a child who wasn't coming home. The investigation was stalling, the gears grinding against the grit of a case that had no handle. Jim Miller found himself returning to the cul-de-sac every night after a shift. He would stand in the dark, smelling the damp earth, trying to feel the vibration of the crime. He was looking for the Manwa that his eyes had missed, but his soul might recognize. He looked at the houses surrounding the spot, the neat lawns, the darkened windows, the white picket fences. Somewhere behind one of those doors, or perhaps in a house, just like it a few streets over, someone was sitting in a chair, breathing the same air, watching the same news, and keeping a secret that was rotting them from the inside out. The predator was hiding in plain sight, protected by the very safety that Oakhaven prided itself on. This wasn't just a missing person case. It was a psychological siege. The cold case hadn't just begun. It had already taken root, a dark seed planted in the soil of 1984 that would take 4 decades to finally, painfully, bloom into the truth. The clock on the precinct wall continued to click, but for Sarah Miller, time had already stopped, leaving only the echo of a spinning wheel and the scent of a browning apple in the grass. The first winter arrived with a brutal, bone-chilling indifference, burying the Oakhaven cul-de-sac under a thick, suffocating blanket of white. By December 1984, the vibrant cerulean thread and the spinning wheel of Sarah Schwinn were memories frozen beneath the ice. The missing posters, once crisp and urgent, were now warped by moisture, the ink of Sarah's smile running like dark tears down the telephone poles. This was the transition from a current event to a local legend, the moment when a tragedy begins to petrify into a haunting. The investigation hadn't stopped, but it had slowed to the rhythmic, agonizing pulse of a heart failing. Detective Jim Miller found himself staring out the precinct window at the falling snow, realizing that every snowflake was another layer of distance between the girl and the truth. The woods were now a frozen fortress, impenetrable to search dogs and boots alike. The ground was hard as iron, sealing away any secrets that might have been buried in the leaf litter. The Manwa Bo NGO, the open-ended clues, were being filed away in cabinets that felt more like coffins. The urgency of the sirens had been replaced by the heavy, silent weight of a town that was learning to live with a hole in its heart. It was during this first, dark winter that the myth of the man in the tan van truly took root, spreading through Oakhaven like a low-grade fever. It started with a single report. A neighbor 3 streets over who claimed to have seen a nondescript, rust-spotted tan Ford Econoline idling near the park 2 days before Sarah vanished. Then came another report, then 10, then 50. Suddenly, every tan van in the tri-state area was a rolling crime scene. The police were inundated with sightings at gas stations, outside grocery stores, parked near playgrounds. It was a SOC Tsong Dong that manifested as a collective hallucination born of pure terror. Parents would see a tan van and instinctively pull their children into their houses, bolting the doors and watching through the slats of the blinds. The vehicle became a phantom, a metallic beast that lived in the periphery of the town's vision. Jim Miller spent weeks tracking down every registered owner of a tan van within 100 miles. He interviewed plumbers, delivery drivers, and retirees. He checked upholstery for stains and floors for blue threads. But the man in the tan van remained a ghost, a convenient shape for the town's fear to inhabit, a monster with no face and no license plate. As the calendar turned to 1985, the psychological landscape of Oakhaven had been permanently altered. The Matt Titchby and wasn't just a news story anymore. It was the atmosphere. You could feel it in the way the grocery store clerks avoided eye contact with Sarah's mother, Martha, when she walked down the aisles with a hollow, frantic look in her eyes. You could hear it in the silence of the school bus stops, where children stood in tight, guarded circles, no longer allowed to roam the neighborhood. The cold case was a shadow that followed everyone home. Elias Thorne, the janitor who had been the first focal point of suspicion, found himself a pariah in his own town. He was a man whose life had been dissected and found wanting, even though no evidence linked him to the crime. His windows were broken by rocks thrown in the night. His name was whispered in the hallways of the school like a curse. The investigation had claimed its first collateral victim. Jim Miller watched Thorne's slow descent into madness with a sense of helpless guilt. He knew the man was likely innocent, but in the absence of a real killer, the town needed a scapegoat. They needed someone to hate, so they didn't have to hate the fact that they were helpless. The 6-month anniversary brought a new wave of media attention, but it was different this time. It was giant gone, sensationalist, and voyeuristic. National tabloids arrived, their reporters prowling the Millers' lawn like vultures. They didn't want the truth, they wanted the shivers. They wanted photos of Sarah's empty bedroom. They wanted quotes about the evil in the Oaks. The headlines were a barrage of man-moi KY law and secret cult theories that made Jim Miller's blood boil. They spoke of satanic rituals in the woods, of international kidnapping rings, of things that belonged in horror movies rather than the quiet, mundane reality of a missing girl. This was the birth of the cold case as entertainment, a transformation that stripped the tragedy of its humanity and turned Sarah Miller into a character in a national drama. Every time a new theory was broadcast, the police hotline would light up with hundreds of calls from psychics and witnesses who had seen the crime in a dream. The investigation was being drowned in noise, a cacophony of nonsense that buried the few legitimate leads they had left under a mountain of static. Spring arrived, not with hope, but with the grim reality of what the thaw might reveal. As the snow melted away, revealing the gray, dead grass of the previous year, the search parties went back into the woods. They moved in lines, their eyes fixed on the ground, looking for the man-moi that the winter had hidden. They were looking for a shoe, a ribbon, or a shallow depression in the earth. The man-moi boat NGO was now a physical dread. Jim Miller walked the perimeter of the mall construction site, a massive project that had just broken ground 3 miles from the disappearance site. He watched the bulldozers tear into the earth, their heavy steel blades churning up decades of soil. He felt a nagging, intuitive pull toward the site, but there was no evidence to justify stopping a multi-million-dollar project. The earth was giving up nothing but rocks and roots. The Matt Titchby Inn was becoming a permanent fixture of the terrain, a secret that the land itself seemed determined to keep. The 1-year mark, October 12, 1985, was a day of mourning that felt like a funeral with no body. A vigil was held at the Oakhaven Community Center. Hundreds of people gathered, holding candles that flickered in the autumn wind. The air was the same as it had been the night Sarah disappeared, crisp, metallic, smelling of damp leaves. Martha Miller stood at the podium, her voice a thin, ragged thread that seemed like it would snap at any moment. She didn't talk about evidence or investigations. She talked about Sarah's favorite book, about the way she laughed at her own jokes, about the friendship bracelet she had been making. The "do and quoi viu" on was a palpable, vibrating grief that filled the room. Jim Miller stood at the back, his hat in his hand, feeling the weight of his failure like a physical burden. He had spent 365 days chasing ghosts. He had looked into the eyes of 1,000 strangers, hoping to see a flicker of guilt. He had read every file, interviewed every witness, and he was no closer to the truth than he had been when the front wheel of that bike was still spinning. By the end of the first year, the case was officially moved to the Cold Case Unit, a fancy name for a filing cabinet in the basement of the state police headquarters. The task force was disbanded. The FBI moved on to other, more active kidnappings. The reporters packed up their cameras and headed to the next tragedy. Oakhaven was left alone with its ghost. The SOC Song Dong had hardened into a permanent cynicism. People started moving away. The Millers stayed, their house a monument to a moment in time that refused to pass. The Manwa KY La were now just stories told to new residents, warnings about the darkness that lived in the woods. The town was moving on, but it was moving on with a limp. Every time a child rode their bike past the cul-de-sac, their parents would watch from the window until the child was safely inside. The innocence of Oakhaven hadn't just been stolen. It had been murdered. Jim Miller didn't stop. He couldn't. He took the files home. He spent his nights in a dimly lit den, surrounded by the black and white photos of the woods and the grainy snapshots of the man in the tan van leads. He began to look at the case not as a detective, but as a historian. He started looking for patterns in older cases, disappearances from the 70s, from the 60s. He was looking for a predatory rhythm, a recurring shadow that had been stalking the region for decades. He found nothing definitive, but he felt the presence of something. A manwa that wasn't a physical object, but a feeling of being watched. He began to suspect that the killer wasn't a drifter, wasn't a man in a tan van from far away. He began to suspect that the killer was someone who knew the rhythms of the town, someone who knew when the streetlights came on and when the police changed shifts. Someone who was currently sitting at a kitchen table, drinking a cup of coffee, and watching the same sunset that Sarah Miller would never see again. The first year had ended, but the silence was just beginning to deepen, a 40-year countdown that had only just reached its first agonizing milestone. The transition from the 1980s into the 1990s didn't bring the new world the tech optimist promised. It only brought a more sophisticated kind of silence. By 1989, 5 years had passed since the spinning wheel of Sarah Miller's bicycle finally stopped. The case was no longer a wound. It was a scar, thick and jagged, that the town of Oakhaven wore with a grim, practiced normalcy. The man in the tan van had become a campfire story, a bogeyman used by parents to ensure their children were home by the time the streetlights flickered to life. But for Detective Jim Miller, the mystery wasn't a story. It was a parasite. He had moved from the precinct's active floor to a cramped, windowless office where the walls were papered with the faces of the missing. He was no longer just investigating a crime. He was archiving a tragedy. The 1989 5-year anniversary news special was a somber affair, a grainy VHS recording of a community trying to convince itself it hadn't forgotten, even as the missing flyers were being painted over on the brick walls of the town square. The SOC Song Dong, the community shock, had evolved into a communal amnesia, a desperate, silent agreement to look away from the woods. Then, in the sweltering July of 1990, the ice finally cracked. A manwa KY La, a strange clue, emerged not from a lab, but from a terrifying echo of the past. 30 miles north, in the sleepy suburb of Cedar Creek, another 12-year-old girl named Amy Vance was riding her bike home from a swimming pool. The sun was still high, the heat shimmering off the asphalt in waves of liquid gold. A car, not a van, but a low-slung, dark sedan, began to shadow her. It moved with a predatory patience, keeping pace with her pedaling, its engine a low, guttural thrum that drowned out the sound of the cicadas. Amy, sensing the pressure of a gaze she couldn't see, turned onto a side street. The sedan followed. It accelerated, cutting her off, the tires screaming against the curb. A man stepped out. He didn't run. He walked with a calm, terrifying purpose. He said nothing. He reached for her, his hand gloved in black leather despite the 100-degree heat. Amy screamed, a raw, primal sound that shattered the suburban afternoon. And a neighbor, a man watering his lawn just 20 feet away, dropped his hose and ran toward the curb. The predator didn't panic. He simply stepped back into the car, reversed with surgical precision, and vanished into the maze of backroads. When the report reached Jim Miller's desk, he felt a jolt of electricity that hadn't touched his nerves in half a decade. This wasn't a tan van. This was the dark sedan with the mismatched door, a detail Amy's neighbor had caught in a split second of clarity. The driver's side door was a flat, matte black, while the rest of the car was a deep, bruised purple. It was a memoir so specific it felt like a miracle. Jim Miller didn't wait for permission. He was in his car and halfway to Cedar Creek before the facts had finished printing the police report. He sat with Amy Vance, looking into her eyes, seeing the same reflection of terror that he imagined had been the last thing Sarah Miller ever saw. Amy's description of the man was chillingly vague, yet hauntingly familiar. He looked like everyone else. He looked like a dad. He looked like a teacher. The predator wasn't a monster from a movie. He was a master of the mundane. He was a man who knew how to disappear in a crowd because he was the crowd. The 1990 investigation was a frantic, high-stakes hunt that Oak Haven hadn't seen since the first night. Jim Miller coordinated with 3 different counties, setting up roadblocks and scouring DMV records for every dark sedan with a mismatched door within a 300-mile radius. This was the era where cold case investigations were supposed to be revolutionized by the DNA revolution. Sir Alec Jeffreys had discovered genetic fingerprinting just a few years prior, and the FBI was beginning to talk about a national database. Jim Miller saw the future, and he reached for it with both hands. He went back to the evidence locker. He took the blue thread, the half-eaten apple, and the scrapings from the bicycle's handlebars. He sent them to the state's newest forensic lab, demanding a DNA profile. He spent weeks in a state of hypervigilance, convinced that the dark sedan was the key that would finally turn the lock. The headlines were back. New lead in Miller case, the predator returns, a mother's hope rekindled. Martha Miller sat by her phone for the first time in years, her hand trembling as she touched the rotary dial. But the 1990s were a cruel decade for forensic science. The technology was a toddler, prone to stumbling and making mistakes. After 6 months of waiting, the lab results came back like a death sentence. The blue thread was too degraded. The enzymes had eaten away at whatever genetic material might have been there. The apple had been handled by too many people in the initial chaos of 1984, leaving a cocktail of DNA that was impossible to untangle. And the handlebars, the most promising source of a man-moi KY law, didn't yield enough cells for the primitive testing methods of the time. The DNA revolution had arrived, but it had arrived too late for Sarah Miller. The dark sedan, too, proved to be a phantom. They found 12 cars that matched the description. None of the owners had a criminal record. None of them could be placed in Oak Haven in 1984. The lead that had felt like a lightning bolt slowly dissipated into a fog of could-have-beens and almosts. By 1992, the SOC Song Dong had turned into a bitter, resentful exhaustion. The town was tired of being the place where the girl went missing. The real estate market in Oak Haven had plummeted. For sale signs stood like tombstones on every street. People were fleeing the memory of Sarah Miller, moving to cities where the woods weren't so deep and the neighbors didn't have secrets. Jim Miller found himself increasingly isolated. His obsession with the dark sedan had made him a pariah at the precinct. Younger detectives whispered that he was chasing ghosts, that he was a man stuck in 1984 while the rest of the world was moving toward the internet and the global village. He started drinking, the scotch acting as a buffer between his waking life and the image of that spinning bicycle wheel. He began to carry a copy of Sarah's school photo in his wallet, a constant reminder of the girl he had failed. The case wasn't just cold, it was petrified. The Matt Titchbian, the mysterious disappearance, was now a decade old. In 1994, a decade after the crime, the Miller family home was finally put on the market. Thomas and Martha couldn't live in the museum anymore. They moved to a small apartment 2 towns over, leaving behind the bedroom that had been frozen in time. The new owners of the house were a young couple from Chicago, oblivious to the history of the soil they now owned. They ripped up the carpet where Sarah used to play, they repainted the walls where she had measured her height, and they cut down the old oak tree in the backyard that she had climbed. It was a physical erasure of her existence. Jim Miller watched the renovation from his car, parked across the street, feeling a sense of profound existential dread. If the house was gone and the evidence was useless, what was left of Sarah Miller? Only the files in his basement. Only the blue thread in the evidence bag. Only the silence of the woods. The mid-90s brought a new kind of man-moi beau NGO. the rise of the serial killer profile. The FBI's behavioral science unit began to look at the Oakhaven case through the lens of the organized offender. They told Jim Miller that Sarah's killer was likely someone with a stable job, someone who might even be married, someone who collected his victims not just physically, but psychologically. This was a SOC to the old-school detective who had always looked for a monster in a basement. The idea that the killer could be a respected member of the community, a pillar of Oakhaven, was a poison that began to seep into his mind. He started looking at his colleagues differently. He started looking at the men he went to church with, the men who coached Little League, the men who had been the most vocal during the search in 1984. He realized that the greatest man moi ky law wasn't a physical object, but the sheer, terrifying invisibility of the predator. The monster didn't hide in the woods. He hid in the light. As 1995 bled into 1996, a new lead surfaced, one that seemed so bizarre it was almost dismissed out of hand. A former prisoner in a state penitentiary, looking for a reduced sentence, claimed he had shared a cell with a man who bragged about a girl in the Oaks. The man described a detail that had never been released to the public, the half-eaten apple. Jim Miller felt the air leave his lungs. This was it, the hold-back evidence, the one thing only the killer and the police knew. He rushed to the prison, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But when he arrived, he found that the witness was a pathological liar, a man who had spent years studying old newspapers and had simply made a lucky guess based on the Browning apple mentioned in a local 1985 tabloid. The man moi was a mirage, a cruel trick played by a man with nothing to lose. Jim Miller walked out of the prison into a freezing rain, realizing that the truth was further away than it had ever been. The decade was closing, and the 40-year timeline was only 25% complete. The world was worrying about Y2K, about the digital collapse of society, but in Oakhaven, the only collapse that mattered had already happened. The cold case was no longer a headline. It was a footnote. Sarah Miller was no longer a girl. She was a ghost. Jim Miller, now a man in his late 50s, stood in his den, looking at the map of the woods. He noticed something he had never seen before, a tiny, hand-drawn mark on an old surveyor's map from 1982. It was a marker for a well, an old irrigation point that had been decommissioned years before Sarah vanished. It was located exactly 3 miles from the cul-de-sac, in a patch of land that was currently being surveyed for a new shopping mall. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He looked at the mark, then at the photo of the blue thread. He began to wonder if the earth wasn't hiding Sarah, but holding her. He began to wonder if the killer hadn't just taken her, but had placed her somewhere where the world would eventually build its future right on top of her. The Matt Titchbean was about to enter its most silent phase, the long, dark sleep of the early 2000s, where the only thing that moved was the dust on the files and the slow, inexorable march of a killer's aging heart. The turn of the millennium didn't arrive with a digital apocalypse, but for the case of Sarah Miller, it brought something far more final, the sound of pouring concrete. By the year 2000, the Matt Titchbean had been a part of Oakhaven's soil for 16 years, a lingering ghost that the town was desperate to exorcise. The Oakhaven Mall, once a controversial blueprint in a dusty planning office, was now a massive steel and glass reality. It rose from the earth like a monument to progress, its sprawling parking lots covering the very woods where thousands had once searched for a little girl in a denim jacket. Detective Jim Miller stood on the perimeter of the construction site on a humid Tuesday morning, watching as the heavy mixers emptied their gray, liquid weight into the foundations. He felt a sickening sensation in the pit of his stomach, a primal intuition that the truth wasn't being discovered. It was being paved over. The Manoir boat NGO weren't just cold. They were being entombed under thousands of tons of reinforced cement. This was the era of the SOC Songdong being replaced by Songdong Lang Quain. The shock of the community being replaced by the community of the forgotten. The shopping mall became the new heart of the town, a cathedral of consumerism where teenagers hung out near the fountain, unaware that they were walking over a graveyard of unanswered questions. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was shifting. A new generation of officers had arrived, men and women for whom 1984 was an ancient history lesson, a story from a world before the internet, cell phones, and global connectivity. The new chief of police, a man named Henderson who prioritized clearance rates and digital efficiency, looked at the Sarah Miller file and saw a budget drain. He didn't see the girl with the ribbon in her hair. He saw 3,000 man-hours of unsolved status that dragged down the department's statistics. In early 2001, the order was given. The Miller case was to be moved to the permanent cold archive. This wasn't just a change in status. It was a death sentence for the investigation. Jim Miller, now just a few years from retirement, fought the decision with a desperation that bordered on insubordination. He argued that the new CODIS database, the combined DNA index system, was just beginning to gain momentum. He argued that the Manoir KY law of the blue thread and the skin scrapings from the bike still held secrets that 2001 technology couldn't yet whisper. But Henderson was firm. The file was boxed, taped shut, and moved to a climate-controlled storage facility 40 miles away. The cold case was no longer in the building. The ghost had been evicted. Jim Miller's life began to mirror the case he couldn't solve. His house became a satellite precinct of one. His basement was a labyrinth of photocopied reports, maps with fading ink, and a wall-sized timeline that stretched from 1984 to the present. He was looking for the manoir that exists between the lines of a testimony, the flicker of a lie that had survived 16 years of scrutiny. He started visiting Martha Miller in her small apartment. She was a shadow of the woman who had stood on the community center podium in 1985. Her eyes were clouded by cataracts and a grief that had turned into a permanent, internal weather system. They didn't talk about leads or suspects anymore. They talked about the way Sarah used to hum when she was doing her homework. They talked about the silence of them all. Martha told him she could feel Sarah every time she drove past a shopping center, a phantom vibration in her teeth that told her the girl was still close. Jim didn't tell her about his theory of the old irrigation well. He didn't tell her that he believed the killer had watched the mall being built with a smile on his face, knowing that the world was doing his work for him, sealing the evidence in a tomb of retail and rebar. In 2002, a brief, giant-gone spark of hope flickered across the national news. A serial killer caught in the Pacific Northwest, a man who had preyed on young girls in the mid-'80s, began to confess to crimes across the country to delay his execution. He mentioned a town of Oaks. He mentioned a bicycle in the dark. The media descended on Oakhaven again, the cameras catching the neon signs of the mall as a backdrop to the breaking news. Jim Miller flew out to the prison at his own expense, sitting across from a man whose eyes were as empty as a gutter. He spent 4 hours in that reinforced glass cage, showing the killer photos of Sarah. But the man was a predator of a different species. He liked the attention, the power of holding a family's hope in his filthy hands. He got the details wrong. He talked about a red bike. He talked about a rainy night. Sarah's bike was chrome, and the night was bone dry. The manoir was another hallucination, a cruel game played by a dying monster. Jim Miller flew home in a state of profound exhaustion, the realization hitting him that the real killer wasn't a famous monster in a cage. The real killer was someone who had never been caught, someone who had mastered the art of being ordinary. As the 20th anniversary approached in 2004, the town of Oakhaven prepared a small memorial service. It wasn't the sea of candles it had been in the first year. It was 20 people in a park, huddled against a biting October wind. The SOC Songdong had long since turned into a dull background ache. Most people in the town had moved there after 1990. To them, Sarah Miller was just a name on a plaque, a tragic footnote in a local history book. During the service, a local reporter asked Jim Miller if he still believed the case would be solved. Jim looked at the mall in the distance, its massive parking lot lights casting a fake, orange glow over the horizon. He didn't answer with a yes or no. He said, "The truth doesn't evaporate. It just waits." It was a quote that sounded good on the evening news, but in his heart, he felt the weight of the concrete. He felt the silence of the cold case growing louder with every passing year. He was 60 years old. His hand shook when he held the magnifying glass over the 1984 crime scene photos. He was running out of time, while the killer was merely growing old in the sun. The 2004 files showed something that Jim had missed in his previous 1,000 reviews: a small, handwritten note from a junior officer in 1985. The note mentioned a mismatch in the utility logs during the week of the disappearance. A section of the old logging road, near the site that would become the mall, had seen an unexplained surge in water usage from an old, supposedly decommissioned irrigation pump. In the chaos of the initial search, the note had been buried. Jim Miller tracked down the officer, now a retired grandfather living in Florida. The man barely remembered the note. "It was a glitch," he said over a crackling phone line. "The whole town was a mess back then. We thought it was just a broken pipe." But Jim knew better. A surge in water meant the pump had been turned on. Why would someone turn on a decommissioned pump in the middle of a kidnapping investigation? The man moi KY law was screaming at him from 2 decades in the past. He realized that the killer hadn't just used the well as a grave. He might have used the very infrastructure of the town to hide his tracks. But when Jim took this new lead to the department, he was met with a wall of bureaucracy. To investigate the irrigation logs, they would need to subpoena a record from a utility company that had gone bankrupt in 1998. To check the physical site, they would need to tear up the loading dock of a major department store at the Oak Haven Mall. The cost would be astronomical. The evidence was circumstantial at best. Henderson, the chief, laughed him out of the office. "You want to tear up a Sears because of a 19-year-old water bill?" he asked, his voice dripping with a modern, cold pragmatism. "Jim, go home. Play with your grandkids. Let the girl rest." But Jim Miller couldn't let her rest. He knew that the Matt Titchby and wasn't a ghost story. It was a physical reality hidden beneath the feet of thousands of shoppers. Every time a cash register rang in that mall, it felt to him like a celebration of a crime. The cold case was now 20 years old, and the 40-year resolution was exactly halfway through its long, dark journey. Jim Miller officially retired in December 2004. On his last day, he didn't take his pension papers or his service weapon first. He went to the evidence storage facility 40 miles away. He used his remaining authority to sign out the Sarah Miller evidence box for final review. He drove it home and put it in the center of his dining room table. He opened the lid and the smell of 1984 drifted out. The scent of old paper, the faint, metallic tang of the bicycle handlebars, and the eerie, synthetic stillness of the blue thread. He realized then that he was no longer a detective. He was a guardian. He was the only person left who truly remembered the color of the sky on the night Sarah vanished. The Manoir Boat NGO were his life's work. As the snow began to fall outside his window, mirroring the first winter of the case, he made a silent vow to the girl in the photo. He would not let the concrete win. He would wait for the science to catch up to the sin. The 2000s would be a decade of waiting, of watching the mall pulse with life while the truth remained a cold, dark secret in the earth, waiting for a generation that hadn't even been born to find the key to the tomb. The mid-2000s were the dark ages of the Miller case. There were no new leads, no giant gaunt confessions, no strange clues. The world was focused on wars, on the rise of social media, on a global economy that was beginning to shudder. Sarah Miller was a name that had finally, it seemed, been erased from the public consciousness. Even the local newspaper stopped doing the anniversary retrospectives. The memorial in the park was discontinued due to lack of interest. Martha Miller passed away in her sleep in 2006. Her last words a whispered name that the nurse couldn't quite catch. With her death, the last living link to Sarah's daily life was gone. Jim Miller attended the funeral alone. He stood at the grave, looking at the empty space next to Martha, a space reserved for a daughter whose body had never been found. He felt a profound sense of isolation. He was the keeper of a story that no one wanted to hear anymore. The SOC Tsongdong was a fossil. The case was a ghost. But as he sat in his basement that night, staring at the blue thread under a microscope he had bought with his own money, he saw something. It wasn't a new piece of evidence, but a new way of looking at the old. He realized that the thread wasn't just a fiber. It was a map of a manufacturing process. And in the world of the future, A map was all he would need to find the man who had left it behind. The year 2010 didn't arrive with a whisper. It arrived with the hum of 1 billion processors and the blinding glow of 1 million liquid crystal displays. The world had become a digital web, a place where secrets went to hide in the noise, but also where the forgotten were suddenly, violently resurrected. For Sarah Miller, 26 years had passed since her bicycle wheel had whispered its final revolution on that Oak Haven cul-de-sac. To the new residents of the town, she was a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered by grandmothers. But in the vast, lawless frontier of the internet, Sarah Miller was becoming something else, a viral obsession. The cold case was no longer a box in a basement. It was a high-resolution scan on a server in Northern Virginia. It was a thread on a message board where thousands of people who had never set foot in Oak Haven dissected every grainy photograph and every contradictory witness statement with the clinical intensity of a surgical team. This was the era of the citizen detective, the rise of a collective intelligence that didn't need a badge or a warrant to hunt for the truth. They called themselves the Oak Haven Watchers, and they were about to breathe new, digital life into a case that the physical world had tried its best to bury under the concrete of a shopping mall. Detective Jim Miller, now 70 years old and walking with the stiff, measured gait of a man who had carried the weight of a child's disappearance for 3 decades, sat in his study. The room was no longer just filled with paper. It was illuminated by the flickering light of a high-end computer monitor his grandson had set up for him. He was a relic in a digital age, a man of leather-bound notebooks and physical evidence, trying to navigate a world of metadata and geolocation. But he realized, with a clarity that made his hands shake, that the Matt Titchby and the mysterious disappearance was being viewed by more eyes in a single day in 2012 than it had been in the entire decade of the 80s. People were analyzing the background of the 1984 search photos, using software to sharpen the faces of the onlookers, looking for the man-moi, KY law, that a human eye in 1984 would have missed. They were looking for a man who wasn't searching, a man who was watching. They were looking for the predator who hides in plain sight by pretending to be part of the grief. One particular online thread began to gain traction in the winter of 2013. A user named Archivist84 had spent months cross-referencing the man in the tan van reports with historical weather patterns and local utility records that Jim had spent years chasing. But Archivist84 had a tool Jim never had, a digitized archive of every local newspaper from the entire tri-state area. They found a pattern of near misses, attempted abductions of young girls on bicycles that stretched back to 1978 and continued through 1992. The SOC Songdong was no longer confined to Oak Haven. It was spreading across the map, revealing a hunting ground that spanned 3 counties. The dark sedan with the mismatched door wasn't a ghost. It was a recurring character in a multi-decade horror story. The internet sleuths weren't just looking for Sarah. They were building a profile of a serial predator who had operated with a terrifying, mundane consistency. They began to map the sightings, creating a heat map of the monster's movements. In the center of that heat map, the frozen heart of the predator's territory, was Oak Haven. While the citizen detectives were building their digital maps, a more quiet and profound revolution was happening in the sterile halls of molecular biology. The concept of forensic genetic genealogy was still in its infancy, a whispered possibility among the vanguard of forensic scientists. They were beginning to realize that DNA wasn't just a fingerprint, it was a family tree. In 2014, 30 years after the crime, Jim Miller received a phone call from a young woman at the state crime lab. She didn't have news of a match in the Cody's database. She had something more experimental. She wanted to take the microscopic skin cells recovered from the handlebars of Sarah's bicycle, the man-moi that had been deemed useless in the 90s, and run them through a process called single nucleotide polymorphism, SNP, testing. It was a technique used by genealogy companies like Ancestry and 23andMe to help people find their distant cousins. "We don't need a match to the killer," she told Jim, her voice crackling with a futuristic excitement. "We just need a match to his second cousin." Jim Miller felt a cold shiver of hope, a sensation so sharp it was almost painful. For 30 years, he had been looking for a man. Now, the science was telling him he could find a man by looking for his family. But the process was expensive, and the legal hurdles were a labyrinth of privacy laws and jurisdictional red tape. The cold case was officially inactive, and the state wasn't willing to fund a fishing expedition into the private DNA data of millions of citizens. The investigation stalled again, caught between the soaring possibilities of the future and the rigid bureaucracy of the present. The Matt Titchby in remained a secret, the science held at bay by the law, while Sarah Miller's killer, now likely an old man himself, continued to breathe the same air as the people who were hunting him. The mid-2010s were a time of giant true crime documentaries. The Girl in the Oak became a 6-part podcast series that topped the charts in 2016. It brought a new wave of tourists to Oak Haven, people who wanted to see the cul-de-sac and the shopping mall that had paved over the woods. They took selfies near the Bronze Memorial, their faces reflecting a voyeuristic sadness. To them, the case was a narrative, a mystery to be consumed during a commute. But to Jim Miller, the podcast was a weapon. It kept the fire burning. It forced the local police department to assign a liaison to the case, a young, tech-savvy detective named Sarah Chun, who had been named after the missing girl by her parents, who had lived through the SOC Songdong in 1984. Detective Chun didn't see a box of old papers. She saw a debt that hadn't been paid. She worked with Jim in his basement, bridging the gap between the old-school intuition and the new-school data mining. By 2018, the breakthrough that would change everything finally happened. Not in Oak Haven, but in California. The arrest of the Golden State Killer using genetic genealogy sent a shockwave through the law enforcement community. The impossible had been achieved. The wall of silence had been breached. Suddenly, the fishing expedition that the state lab had proposed for the Miller case wasn't a fringe theory. It was the gold standard. The legal hurdles began to crumble. The man-moi, KY law, of the blue thread and the skin cells were pulled out of the evidence locker for what everyone knew would be the final time. The DNA was extracted, amplified, and uploaded to a public genealogy database, where people voluntarily shared their genetic profiles to find their ancestors. The search didn't return a name. It returned a third cousin once removed. It was a woman in her 60s living in a trailer park in Arizona. She had no criminal record. She had never been to Oak Haven. But her DNA shared a specific, undeniable segment of the 14th chromosome with the cells found on Sarah's bike. The cold case was no longer a ghost story. It was a genealogy project. Sarah Chun and Jim Miller spent months mapping the woman's family tree, going back to the late 1800s and then working their way forward. They tracked the births, the marriages, and the deaths. They looked for the lost branches, the sons who had moved away, the cousins who had drifted into the shadows. It was a painstaking digital reconstruction of a bloodline, a hunt through census records and obituary columns. As they narrowed the tree down, they found a family that had lived in the Oak Haven area in the early 80s. The Penhaligons. They were a family of tradesmen, mechanics, and carpenters. They were the kind of people who were essential to a town, but invisible in its social hierarchy. They had 3 sons. One had died in a motorcycle accident in 1988. One was living in a nursing home with advanced dementia. And the third, Arthur Penhaligon, was still alive, living a quiet, solitary life on the coast. He was the quiet neighbor, the man who had been a mechanic in 1984, the man who knew how to fix a dark sedan with a mismatched door, and the man who knew exactly where the decommissioned irrigation wells were located. The Matt Titchby was finally converging on a single point in space and time. Jim Miller stood in front of his wall-sized timeline, his eyes fixed on the name Arthur Penhaligon. He realized that he had seen that name before. He dug through his original 1984 notebooks, his fingers trembling as he turned the yellowed pages. And there it was, on page 412, a list of employees at the local garage who had been interviewed during the first week of the search. Penhaligon had been there. He had spoken to Jim Miller. He had looked the detective in the eye and said he hadn't seen anything. He had been a man-moi that was discarded because he was too ordinary, too helpful, too much like everyone else. The SOC wasn't that they had found him. It was that he had been there the whole time, a wolf in a wool cardigan, watching the search parties from the edge of the woods. The investigation entered its final, most delicate phase in late 2019. They didn't have enough for a warrant yet. A third cousin's DNA was probable cause, but it wasn't a conviction. They needed the man's direct DNA. They needed to bridge the final gap. Detective Sarah Chun was sent to the coastal town where Penhaligon lived. She watched him from a distance, a man in his late 50s who spent his days fishing and his evenings on his porch. He looked like a grandfather. He looked like the kind of man you'd ask for directions. She waited for him to discard something, a coffee cup, a cigarette, but a piece of gum. She waited for the man-moi that would finally seal the tomb. The tension was a physical pressure, a high-frequency hum that vibrated in the bones of everyone involved. They were 48 hours away from the end of a 40-year journey. The silence was about to be broken, not by a scream, but by the snap of a plastic evidence bag. As the decade of the 2010s came to a close, the world was on the brink of another kind of crisis. But in the small, darkened study of a retired detective in Oak Haven, the only thing that mattered was the profile on the screen. The cold case was no longer cold. It was white-hot. The 40-year resolution was reaching its crescendo. Jim Miller looked at the photo of Sarah one last time before he turned off the monitor. He thought about the spinning wheel, the half-eaten apple, and the blue thread. He thought about the 36 years of silence. He realized that the truth wasn't just a destination. It was a reckoning. And for Arthur Penhaligon, the reckoning was standing on his doorstep, disguised as a young woman with a plastic bag and a very long memory. The 40-year cold case was about to be solved, and the Duum Quaviuon, the echoes of the crime, were about to become a roar that would shatter the peace of two different towns. The fog in Port Haven didn't just roll in from the Pacific. It exhaled a cold, gray breath that smelled of salt, rotting kelp, and the slow decay of things left too long in the damp. It was November 2024. 40 years and 1 month had passed since Sarah Miller pedaled into a void. Detective Sarah Chun sat in a nondescript gray sedan, her breath fogging the corner of the windshield, her eyes fixed on a small, weather-beaten cottage at the end of a gravel spit. Inside that house was Arthur Penhaligon. To his neighbors, he was Artie, the retired mechanic who fixed lawnmowers for free and kept a meticulous garden of hydrangeas. To the data on Chin's tablet, he was a ghost that had finally been given a name by his own bloodline. The Matt Titchbean, the mysterious disappearance, had been reduced to a set of coordinates and a heartbeat. The tension in the car was a physical weight, a high-voltage wire humming in the silence. This wasn't just a stakeout. It was a vigil for a girl who had been dead longer than the detective had been alive. This was the cold case reaching its boiling point, the moment where the abstract theories of the internet sleuths and the grainy photos in Jim Miller's basement were about to collide with a man made of flesh, bone, and secrets. Arthur Penhaligon stepped onto his porch at 7:14 a.m. He was wearing a quilted flannel shirt and carrying a steaming mug of coffee. He looked unremarkable. That was the SOC Songdong, the community shock waiting to happen. People expect monsters to look like gargoyles, to have jagged edges and shadows in their eyes. But Arthur looked like a man who enjoyed the Sunday crossword. He looked like the person you'd trust with your spare key. Chin watched him through a long-range lens, the shutter clicking with a rhythmic metallic snap that felt like a countdown. She was looking for a man-moi ky law, a sign of the predator beneath the skin. Did he check his surroundings? Did he look at the tree lean with a lingering, practiced gaze? He did neither. He simply sipped his coffee and watched the fog. His confidence was a slap in the face to 40 years of investigation. He had lived a full, unburdened life. He had seen the moon rise 10,000 times while Sarah Miller lay in the dark. The injustice of his peace was a roar in Chen's ears. The plan was surgical. They couldn't just knock on his door. They needed the science of ghosts to be absolute. They needed a direct DNA sample to bridge the gap from the third cousin to the killer. Chun followed him when he drove his old, impeccably maintained truck to a local diner called the Salty Spoon. The manoir was sitting on a Formica table, a discarded coffee cup, a paper napkin used to wipe a smudge of egg from a lip, a cigarette but left in an outdoor tray. Every item was a potential tombstone for his freedom. Chun waited in a booth, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched him finish his breakfast. He was methodical. He folded his napkin. He left a precise tip. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who believed he had outrun time itself. When he walked out, leaving the blue ceramic mug on the table, the air in the diner seemed to thin. Chun didn't move immediately. She waited for the manoir ky la to be cleared by the waitress. Then she intercepted it before it hit the trash. The plastic evidence bag zipped shut with a sound like a guillotine. The drive to the state lab was a blur of gray highway and white-knuckled grip. The cold case was now a race against the clock. If Penhaligon sensed the net closing, he could vanish again. He was a man who knew how to blend into the scenery. The DNA profile was run through a high-speed sequencer. The technicians moved with a hushed, reverent intensity. They knew what was in the bag. They knew they were looking at the genetic signature of 1984. Jim Miller was on the phone every hour, his voice a ragged whisper from 300 miles away. Is it him? Sarah, is it him? He was a man holding his breath for 4 decades, his lungs burning for the truth. When the results finally flashed on the screen at 3 a.m. the following morning, the silence in the lab was deafening. A 1:1 match. The skin cells from the 1984 handlebars and the saliva from the 2024 coffee cup were identical. The manoir Bo-N-Geo had been closed. The ghost had a face. The wolf had a name. The tactical briefing at the Port Haven precinct was a masterclass in controlled aggression. No sirens. No lights. They wanted to take him in the gray hour, the time just before dawn when the soul is at its heaviest and the reflex to flee is dampened by sleep. 12 officers, a K-9 unit, and a forensic team stood in the shadows of the gravel spit. Detective Sarah Chun stood at the front, the warrant in her hand feeling like a holy relic. The SOC Tsong-Dong was about to break over this quiet coastal town. They moved in a tactical V, their boots crunching softly on the wet stones. The fog was their ally now, a thick, white curtain that hid the machinery of justice. As they reached the porch, the same porch where he had sipped his coffee 24 hours earlier, the world seemed to hold its breath. The 40-year cold case solved wasn't a headline yet. It was just a knock on a wooden door. The door didn't splinter. It opened. Arthur Penhaligon stood there in his pajamas, his eyes blinking against the glare of the flashlights. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. He looked at the circle of drawn weapons and the grim faces of the officers, and for a split second, the manoir ky la finally appeared. It was in his eyes, a sudden deep-seated exhaustion, the look of a man who had been carrying a heavy trunk for 40 years and was finally, mercifully, being told he could set it down. Chun stepped forward. Her voice was steady, a sharp blade in the morning air. Arthur Penhaligon, you're under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of Sarah Miller. The name that hadn't been spoken to his face in 4 decades, hit him like a physical blow. His knees buckled. The click of the handcuffs was the only sound in the foggy morning, a metallic punctuation mark that ended the longest sentence in Oak Haven's history. The cold case files were no longer in the basement. They were on the table in the interrogation room, a mountain of paper that represented the collective failure and persistence of a generation. Penhaligon sat under the harsh fluorescent lights, his hands cuffed to the bar. He looked smaller now, the monster shrinking into a frail, elderly man. But the deux m'quoi vu on, the echoes of the crime, were everywhere. Chun sat across from him. She didn't use the bad cop routine. She used the weight of the paper. She started laying out the photos. The bike, the blue thread, the 1984 school portrait. Tell us where she is, Arthur, she said, her voice a low, vibrating hum of demand. Give her back to the earth. Give her back to her father. The silence stretched. 1 minute. 5. 10. The clock on the wall clicked, mirroring the one from the Oak Haven precinct in 1984. Then he began to speak. It wasn't a confession of guilt at first. It was a confession of memory. He talked about the man moi ky law of the day, the way the sun hit the chrome of the bicycle, the way the girl's ribbon had fluttered in the wind. He spoke with a terrifying detachment, as if he were describing a movie he had seen a long time ago. He told them about the dark sedan with the mismatched door. He had painted it the very next week, a deep, bruised purple that hid the matte black primer. He told them about the man in the tan van reports and how he had laughed every time he saw them on the news, knowing the world was looking for a ghost while he was standing in line at the grocery store. The Matt Titchbean was being dismantled piece by piece by the man who had constructed it. The most chilling detail wasn't the how, but the where. He confirmed Jim Miller's 20-year-old suspicion, the old irrigation well, the site that was now the Oakhaven Mall. He described the night with a geographic precision that made Chin's skin crawl. He had known the well was there because he had helped maintain the pumps in the late 70s. He knew it was deep. He knew it was forgotten. He had placed her there, he said, because he wanted her to be part of the foundation. The SOC Song Dong would reach its peak when the town realized that for 30 years they had been shopping, eating, and laughing over the grave of the girl they had spent a lifetime mourning. The mall wasn't just a building. It was a monument to his silence. As the sun rose over Port Haven, the news began to leak. The cold case was white-hot. Reporters were scrambling. The internet was exploding. But inside the interrogation room, there was only the sound of a man's voice, finally emptying the dark reservoir of his soul. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for mercy. He seemed fascinated by the DNA, by the science of ghosts that had tracked him down. He asked Chin how they found him. When she told him about the third cousin in Arizona, he smiled a thin, yellowed smile. Family, he whispered. It always comes back to blood. The 40-year cold case was no longer a mystery, but the resolution felt like a hollow victory. The monster was caught, but the girl was still in the dark beneath the concrete, waiting for the light to reach her. The Manwa boat NGO were all accounted for. The blue thread? It was from a windbreaker he had burned in 1985. The half-eaten apple? He had kicked it into the grass, a casual gesture that had become a forensic cornerstone. Every strange clue that had haunted Jim Miller's dreams was a reality in Arthur Penhaligon's past. The interrogation lasted into the evening, a marathon of horror that left the detectives drained and hollow. As they led him out to the transport van, a small crowd of local residents had gathered at the edge of the police tape. They didn't shout. They didn't jeer. They stood in a stunned, vibrating silence, looking at the man they thought they knew. The SOC was total. The piece of Port Haven was dead. The piece of Oakhaven was about to be shattered by the sound of jackhammers. Jim Miller received the final call at 9 p.m. We have the location, Jim. We have the confession. The old man didn't cheer. He didn't weep. He simply sat down in his chair, surrounded by his boxes of files, and closed his eyes. For the first time in 40 years, the clock in his head stopped ticking. The cold case was solved. The 40-year cold case solved headlines were already being written in every newsroom in the country. But the work wasn't over. The recovery was next. The excavation of a memory. The final, painful act of bringing Sarah Miller home. The du m'quoi viu on would continue to echo, but the source of the sound was finally in a cage. As the transport van pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the lingering coastal fog, the Matt Titchby officially became a matter of record. The ghost was gone. Only the truth remained, as cold and hard as the concrete of the Oakhaven Mall. The dawn that broke over the Oakhaven Mall on the morning of November 15th, 2024, was not a celebration of light, but a cold, clinical exposure of a town's deepest shame. The Matt Titchby, the mysterious disappearance that had haunted the collective psyche of 3 generations, was no longer a ghost story. It was a construction project. The mall, a sprawling, neon-lit cathedral of consumerism, stood silent, its massive parking lots cordoned off by miles of yellow crime scene tape that fluttered in the biting wind like the wings of a trapped bird. The SOC Song Dong, the community shock, had reached a fever pitch. People didn't go to work. They stood at the edge of the perimeter, huddling in coats and scarves, their eyes fixed on loading Dock D of the Sears department store. They were there to watch the earth give up its dead. They were there to witness the physical dismantling of a 40-year-old lie. The air was thick with the scent of diesel exhaust, pulverized concrete, and the metallic tang of impending snow. It was a giant gone moment in the truest sense. A sensational, bone-chilling reckoning that turned the mundane act of excavation into a high-stakes ritual of justice. Detective Sarah Chun stood at the center of the chaos, her radio crackling with the urgent, clipped voices of engineers and forensic archaeologists. Beside her stood Jim Miller, a man who looked like he had been carved out of the very oak trees the town was named for. He didn't speak. He just watched as the massive hydraulic jackhammers began their brutal work, the diamond-tipped bits screaming as they bit into the 6-inch layer of reinforced concrete. The sound was deafening, a rhythmic, bone-shaking thud-thud-thud that echoed off the surrounding buildings like a heartbeat. To Jim, it didn't sound like construction. It sounded like an interrogation. Every inch of pavement removed was a word pulled from a reluctant witness. The cold case was being solved with industrial force, the modern world literalizing the process of digging into the past. They were looking for a man moi ky law, a strange clue that Arthur Penhaligon had described in his confession, a concrete cap he had poured himself over the mouth of the irrigation well, a seal that had held for 40 years under the weight of millions of footsteps. The logistics of the dig were a nightmare of structural engineering and forensic precision. The mall's foundation wasn't just a slab of stone. It was a complex web of utility lines, sewage pipes, and electrical conduits. The engineers had warned that a single wrong move could cause a localized collapse, burying the evidence and the recovery team under a mountain of retail debris. But the deux and quoi vu on, the echoes of the crime, were louder than the warnings. The team worked with surgical care, using ground-penetrating radar to map the void beneath the surface. The screens showed a dark, vertical shaft, a hollow throat in the earth that had been silenced in 1984. It was exactly where the man moi of the 1985 utility logs had pointed. Jim Miller felt a bitter surge of vindication. He had been right for 20 years, and for 20 years, the world had told him he was crazy. Now, the world was paying for its silence with the sound of breaking stone. As the sun climbed higher, the crowd grew. The media circus was in full swing, satellite trucks extending their silver necks into the sky, broadcasting the cold case live to a hungry nation. This was the SOC the public craved, the visceral reality of a secret being unearthed. There were people in the crowd who had been Sarah's classmates, now middle-aged parents with gray in their hair, holding their own children's hands with a grip that was too tight. They were looking for closure, but what they were finding was a fresh, raw trauma. The realization that they had walked over Sarah's grave to buy shoes, to see movies, to meet friends, was a psychological poison. The mall, once a symbol of the town's recovery from the tragedy, was now its most horrific monument. The man moi beau NGO were being reconciled in the most brutal way possible. By midday, the jackhammer stopped. The heavy machinery was replaced by men and women with hand tools, their orange vests glowing against the gray dust. They had reached the soil. The transition from the man-made world to the natural one was a threshold of silence. The dust settled, coating everything in a fine, powdery shroud. The forensic archaeologists knelt in the dirt, using brushes and small trowels to clear the debris. They found a cap. It was a rough, uneven circle of old concrete, pitted by time and moisture, but still intact. It looked like a scar on the earth's skin. When the team finally pried it loose, a rush of cold, stagnant air escaped the shaft. A breath from 1984, smelling of wet earth and ancient decay. Sarah Chun felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was the Matt Titchby finally opening its mouth to speak. The descent was a slow, agonizing process. They couldn't just drop a man down. The shaft was narrow and unstable. They used a high-definition remote camera, its lens cutting through the absolute darkness of the well. The feed was transmitted to a monitor in the command tent, where Jim and Sarah watched with bated breath. The camera descended 10 feet, 20, 30. The walls of the well were lined with old, moss-covered stones, the mortar crumbling into sand. And then, at the 35-foot mark, the light caught something that didn't belong to the earth. A flash of blue. Not the vibrant cerulean of the thread, but a faded, dusty denim. Jim Miller let out a sound, a choked, half-strangled sob that he had been holding back for 4 decades. There she was, the Manwa KY La. That ended the search. The recovery took another 6 hours. The team moved with a reverent, funereal pace, aware that they were not just handling evidence, but a child's remains. When the basket was finally raised from the hole, draped in a white sheet, the entire mall perimeter fell into a silence, so profound it felt like the world had stopped turning. The crowd bowed their heads. The reporters lowered their microphones. Even the wind seemed to die down. The Du M'Quoi Vu On had reached its final, somber note. Sarah Miller was no longer a name on a flyer or a photo on a wall. She was back in the light, in her pockets. The forensic team would later find the friendship bracelet Martha had talked about, its colors still faintly visible through the grime of 40 years. Paemutik Bian was over. The 40-year cold case was physically, undeniably solved. As the forensic van pulled away, its tires crunching on the gravel, Jim Miller stood by the open hole in the loading dock. He looked down into the dark, feeling a strange sense of emptiness. The obsession that had defined his life was gone, replaced by a cold, hard truth. The SOC Song Dong would linger for years. The mall would eventually be demolished, the ground consecrated as a park, but the damage was permanent. You don't pave over a tragedy and expect it to stay buried. You don't ignore the Manwa and expect the truth to vanish. The excavation was finished, but the reckoning was just beginning. The town of Oakhaven was finally awake, but it was waking up to a world where the monsters were real and the ground beneath their feet was a map of their own failures. The cold case was closed, but the haunting of Oakhaven had entered a new phase. The trial of Arthur Penhaligon would follow, a giant spectacle of guilt and retribution, but for those who stood in the parking lot that day, the trial was already over. They had seen the truth in the denim jacket and the friendship bracelet. They had heard the truth in the scream of the jackhammers. The Du M'Quoi Vu On would follow them into their homes, into their schools, and into their dreams. Sarah Miller was home, but the town she returned to was a stranger to itself. The 40-year cold case solved was a headline for the world, but for Oakhaven, it was the end of an era of innocence and the beginning of a long, dark memory that no amount of light could ever truly erase. The sun set behind them all, casting long, jagged shadows across the excavation site. The Manwa Bo-NGO were no longer open. The Matt Titchby Inn was a closed book. But as the last of the forensic teams packed their bags, a single, discarded blue thread caught the wind, tumbling across the empty parking lot like a ghost looking for a place to rest. The mystery was gone, but the ghost remained, a permanent part of the landscape, a reminder that some things, once broken, can never be made whole again. The clock had finally struck midnight for Arthur Penhaligon, but for Sarah Miller, the time was forever October 12th, 1984, a loop of chrome, a half-eaten apple, and a silence that had finally, mercifully, been broken. The gavel that signaled the beginning of the end for Arthur Penhaligon didn't sound like justice. It sounded like a dry, cracking bone in a room devoid of air. It was February 2025, 3 months after the jackhammers had silenced the ghost beneath the Oakhaven Mall. The county courthouse, a red brick relic from the turn of the century, was under siege. The SOC Song Dong, the community shock, had metamorphosed into a ravenous hunger for retribution. The lawn outside, usually reserved for sleepy pigeons and the occasional lunch break clerk, was a trampled sea of satellite trucks, protesters, and true crime tourists who had traveled thousands of miles to see the face of the monster. The cold case had become a national spectacle, a giant gone event that dominated the 24-hour news cycle. But inside Courtroom B, the atmosphere was suffocatingly intimate. The air smelled of floor wax, old paper, and the sharp, acidic tang of collective hatred. Detective Jim Miller sat in the front row, his hands folded over the head of his cane, his knuckles white. He wasn't there as an officer anymore. He was there as a witness to the final chapter of a book he had been writing for 40 years. Beside him sat Detective Sarah Chun, her face a mask of professional detachment that barely hid the simmering rage beneath. They were waiting for the man who had turned a town into a graveyard. When Arthur Penhaligon was led into the room, a ripple of cognitive dissonance tore through the gallery. He didn't look like a killer. He didn't look like the architect of a 40-year nightmare. He looked like a fragile, shuffling grandfather in an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. He wore thick glasses and walked with a slight limp, his head bowed not in shame, but in the careful, tentative manner of the elderly. This was the man moi ky la, the strange clue that had allowed him to hide in plain sight for 4 decades. The banality of his evil was a physical slap in the face to everyone who had expected a demon. The man in the tan van was just an old mechanic with liver spots on his hands. The whisper in the room was audible, a collective intake of breath that sounded like the word imp, questioning the reality of the situation. But then he looked up. For a brief second, his eyes met Jim Miller's. There was no remorse in that gaze. There was no fear. There was only a flat, dead shark-like indifference that chilled the marrow of everyone who saw it. In that look, the monster finally revealed itself, stripping away the camouflage of age and frailty. The legal proceedings were a formality, a choreographed dance of Matt Titchby and becoming homicide in the first degree. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA match, the confession, the denim jacket, the friendship bracelet. But the defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer who looked as if he hadn't slept in a week, wasn't fighting for an acquittal. He was fighting for a life sentence over the death penalty. The strategy was simple: plead guilty, avoid the spectacle of a jury trial, and let the state save millions of dollars in appeals. It was a pragmatic move, but to the people of Oakhaven, it felt like a final betrayal. They wanted a trial. They wanted to drag every detail of the man moi beau ngo, the open-ended clues, into the light. They wanted to force Penhaligon to recount every second of that night in October 1984. They wanted him to bleed, metaphorically, on the stand. But the legal system is a machine, not an instrument of vengeance. The plea deal was accepted. The trial would essentially be a sentencing hearing, a platform for the victim impact statements, and the formal reading of the crimes. The reading of the statement of facts was a grueling 2-hour descent into hell. The prosecutor, a woman with a voice like tempered steel, read the details of Penhaligon's confession into the record. She described the predatory rhythm he had established in the early 80s, the way he had stalked the neighborhoods, learning the schedules of the children. She described the night of October 12, 1984, with a granular clarity that made listeners weep. She explained the man moi ky la of the spinning wheel, how Penhaligon had struck Sarah with the open door of his car, knocking her off balance without crashing into her, a move of practiced precision. She described the silence of the abduction, the speed with which he had vanished into the network of backroads he knew better than the police. And then, the most harrowing detail of all, the burial. The description of how he had lowered her into the irrigation well, how he had mixed the concrete cap by hand in the moonlight, sealing her away with the calm deliberation of a man patching a roof. The deux and quoi vu on, the echoes of the crime, filled the courtroom, a heavy, suffocating smog of horror. People covered their mouths. Some left the room, unable to bear the weight of the words. Jim Miller didn't move. He listened to every syllable, forcing himself to bear witness to the mechanics of the tragedy he had failed to stop. Then came the victim impact statements. This was the moment the cold case ceased to be a file and became a scream. Cousins, friends, and neighbors took the stand. They spoke of the SOC Songdong that had never truly faded. They spoke of the fear that had ruled their childhoods, the way the town had turned inward, the way trust had evaporated like mist in the sun. A woman who had been Sarah's best friend in 1984 stood up, shaking, holding a faded photograph. She looked directly at Penhaligon and said, "You didn't just kill Sarah. You killed the childhood of an entire generation. You stole the sun from the sky." Penhaligon didn't flinch. He sat staring at the table, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve, seemingly bored by the outpouring of grief. His detachment was the final insult, a silent declaration that he believed he was above their pain, that his 40 years of freedom were a victory that no prison sentence could erase. The judge's sentencing was swift and merciless, though constrained by the plea deal. "Arthur Penhaligon," the judge intoned, his voice booming through the silence, "you are a stain on humanity. You have lived a lie for 40 years, enjoying the sun and the air while Sarah Miller lay in the dark. I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." There was no applause, no cheer, just a heavy, resigned exhale from the gallery. Life in prison for a man of 78 is a mathematical joke. It wasn't justice. It was simply an expiration date. As the bailiffs moved to shackle him, Penhaligon finally spoke. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't address the court. He turned to Jim Miller, his voice a dry, rasping whisper that carried across the quiet room. "I told you," he said, a faint, mocking smile touching his lips. "I was always there." It was a final psychological knife twist, a reminder that the Matt Titchby and had been solved only because science had caught up, not because the detective had outsmarted him. Jim Miller watched him go, feeling not triumph, but a deep, abiding exhaustion. The handcuffs clicked, and the man in the tan van was led away, shuffling out of the world of the living and into the concrete tomb of the state penitentiary. The aftermath of the sentencing was a strange, hollow period for Oak Haven. The news trucks packed up and left. The protesters dispersed. The cold case was officially marked closed in the police database, the red digital stamp looking final and authoritative. The mall was still there, a scarred reminder of the grave. The community was left with the SOC of the details, the knowledge of exactly what had happened. It was a knowledge that tasted like ash. Justice, they realized, is not a time machine. It doesn't bring the girl back. It doesn't undo the 40 years of pain. It just puts a period at the end of a very long, very sad sentence. Jim Miller went back to his empty house. He took the boxes of files, the thousands of pages, the photos, the maps, and he began to burn them in his backyard fire pit. It was a ritual of release. He watched the Manoir Beau NGO, the false leads, the psychic tips, and the reports turn into black smoke and drift up into the winter sky. He was freeing himself from a ghost. He was letting Sarah go. Arthur Penhaligon's time in prison was short, a mere footnote to his long life of stolen freedom. He was placed in protective custody, isolated from the general population who would have likely torn him apart. He spent 23 hours a day in a 6-by-8-foot cell. He didn't receive visitors. He didn't write letters. He became a ghost again, haunting a different kind of box. The guards reported that he slept soundly, that he ate his meals with appetite, that he showed no signs of the torment that a conscience is supposed to inflict. This was the terrifying reality of the psychopath, the absence of internal conflict. He didn't regret the crime. He only regretted the capture. The Matt Titchby was his masterpiece, and he seemed content to relive it in the privacy of his own mind. 6 months after the sentencing, in the sweltering heat of August 2025, the end came. It wasn't a dramatic prison yard shank or a suicide. It was mundane. It was biological. Arthur Penhaligon was found unresponsive in his bunk during the morning count. Massive cardiac arrest. He had died in his sleep, his face relaxed, devoid of pain. When the news reached Oak Haven, it sparked a fresh wave of bitterness. He got away with it. People whispered in the diner and the grocery store. He lived his whole life and died in his sleep. The SOC Song Dong was reignited by the unfairness of the universe. He hadn't suffered. He hadn't rotted in a cell for decades. He had simply checked out, leaving the bill unpaid. The cold case was solved, but the ledger remained unbalanced. The Manoir KY law of his death, a peaceful end for a violent man, was the final injustice in a case defined by them. Jim Miller received the call from Sarah Chun while he was sitting on his porch, watching the sunset. "He's dead, Jim," she said, her voice flat. "Heart attack. Last night." Jim didn't say anything for a long time. He looked at the oak trees across the street, their leaves turning gold in the fading light. He thought about the spinning wheel. He thought about the blue thread. He thought about the look in Penhaligon's eyes in the courtroom. "Good," Jim finally said, though he didn't feel good. He felt nothing. The hate that had sustained him, the obsession that had driven him, had nowhere left to go. The enemy was gone. The war was over. But the battlefield was still strewn with the wreckage of the past. The death of Arthur Penhaligon marked the true end of the Oakhaven mystery. There are no more questions to answer. No more suspects to chase. The story that had begun with a bicycle in a cul-de-sac and ended with a body under a mall was finished. But stories like this don't just end. They settle into the groundwater. They become part of the town's DNA. The legend of the man in the tan van would fade, replaced by the true, grimmer story of the man next door. Parents would still tell the story to their children, a warning about the darkness that exists on the edges of the light. The cold case was closed, but the lesson remained open. Safety is an illusion, and the past is never truly buried, no matter how much concrete you pour over it. In the weeks following Penhaligon's death, a strange peace finally began to descend on Oakhaven. It wasn't a happy peace, but a settled one. The wound had been cleaned, stitched, and scarred over. The Matt Titchby Inn was history now. The memorial park at the former mall site, the section of the loading dock having been demolished and turned into a green space, was finally completed. The bronze statue of the girl on the bicycle stood in the center, surrounded by a garden of white roses. The plaque at the base didn't mention the killer. It didn't mention them all. It simply said, Sarah Miller, 1972 to 1984, found 2024, forever in the light. The case file was archived, and as the first autumn leaves of 2025 began to fall, drifting around the bronze wheels of the statue, the town of Oakhaven finally exhaled, letting go of the breath it had been holding for 41 years. The detective's work was done. Jim Miller, now frail and moving slow, visited the memorial one last time. He touched the bronze handlebar, the metal cold against his palm. He didn't speak to Sarah. He didn't need to. They had said everything there was to say in the silence of the investigation. He turned and walked away, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the pavement, walking out of the story and into the quiet anonymity of the rest of his life. The 40-year cold case was solved. The voiceover was ending. The screen was fading to black. But in the dark, the echo of a spinning wheel could still be heard, a faint, rhythmic whisper reminding the world that while justice can be delayed, the truth, eventually, is inevitable. The silence that follows the closing of a 40-year-old case is not empty. It is crowded with the ghosts of what if. With Arthur Penhaligon dead and Sarah Miller finally laid to rest, the adrenaline of the chase evaporated, leaving behind a landscape scarred by missed opportunities and the brutal clarity of hindsight. The year 2025 became a period of autopsy, not of a body, but of the investigation itself. Experts, true crime historians, and the residents of Oakhaven looked back at the timeline, seeing it not as a straight line to justice, but as a fractured path littered with the debris of systemic failure. The cold case label, they realized, was often a polite synonym for missed clues. The tragedy of Sarah Miller wasn't just that she was taken. It was that she was hidden by the very assumptions that were supposed to find her. The Matt Titchby, the mysterious disappearance, was sustained for 4 decades not by the genius of a criminal, but by the blinding power of a single, collective delusion, the myth of the man in the tan van. This myth, born in the panic of the first 48 hours, was the single greatest accomplice Arthur Penhaligon ever had. It was a SOC Tsong Dong, a community shock that metastasized into a localized hysteria. In a retrospective analysis, it became clear that the tan van reports were a contagion. One terrified neighbor mentioned a van, and suddenly, the human brain's pattern recognition software overwrote reality. Every delivery truck, every contractor, every plumber became a suspect, clogging the tip lines with thousands of false leads. Meanwhile, Penhaligon, driving a dark sedan with a mismatched door, a car that was actually seen and reported by Amy Vance in the neighboring county, slipped through the cracks. The police were looking for a monster in a specific costume, and because Penhaligon didn't wear it, he became invisible. The man moi kewaila. The strange clue of the sedan was buried under the weight of the van sightings. It is a terrifying lesson in cognitive bias. When you decide what the monster looks like before you find him, you guarantee that you will never see him if he looks like your neighbor. Then, there was the tragedy of the lost decades, the era between the primitive forensics of the 1980s and the genetic revelation of the 2020s. The 1990s and 2000s were a purgatory for the Miller case. The DNA revolution was touted as a miracle cure, but for Sarah, it was a taunt. The technology existed, but the sensitivity did not. The blue thread, that vibrantly colored man moi found in the woods, became a symbol of this technological gap. In 1984, it was a lead. In 1994, it was inconclusive. In 2004, it was degraded. By the time the science caught up, the thread was irrelevant, a red herring that had nothing to do with the killer. The real key, the microscopic skin cells on the handlebars, sat in a vacuum-sealed bag, a silent witness, screaming for a listener who hadn't been born yet. The retrospective documentaries focused heavily on this agonizing delay. They showed the timeline of Penhaligon's life, the fishing trips he took, the weddings he attended, the sunsets he watched, all while the evidence that could convict him sat in a cardboard box 40 miles away. It wasn't a failure of effort. It was a failure of time. Justice, in the Miller case, was a prisoner of a calendar. But the most haunting realization, the one that kept Jim Miller awake in the final years of his life, was the matter of the waterlog. The 1985 utility report, the Man Moi Bo NGO, the open-ended clue that had been dismissed as a clerical error. In the autopsy of the investigation, this single piece of paper emerged as the knife in the heart of the Oakhaven Police Department. A junior clerk had flagged an anomaly. The decommissioned pump at the old irrigation well had been activated for 90 minutes on the night of October 13th, 1984, 24 hours after Sarah vanished. Penhaligon needed water to mix the concrete. He had turned on the pump. The machine had recorded the crime. The earth itself had testified. But because the search was focused on the woods and the tan van, the anomaly was filed away. If that log had been investigated in 1985, the fresh concrete would have been found. The body would have been recovered. The parents would have had closure. Penhaligon would have faced a jury of his peers while he was still a young man. Instead, the clue gathered dust for 40 years, a silent indictment of bureaucracy and tunnel vision. It proved that the Matt Titchbean wasn't solved by a stroke of genius. It was solved by correcting a mistake that should never have happened. The psychological toll of these revelations on Oakhaven was profound. The town had to reckon with the fact that they had been living in a crime scene for decades. The Oakhaven Mall, the centerpiece of the community's social life, was retroactively tainted. Every memory made there, every first date at the cinema, every family dinner at the food court, every holiday shopping spree, was now overlaid with the knowledge of what lay beneath the loading dock. The Du M'Quaviuon, the echoes of the crime, rewrote the history of the town. People looked at their family albums, at photos taken in the mall, and felt a wave of nausea. They realized that their normalcy had been purchased with ignorance. The killer, Arthur Penhaligon, hadn't just hidden a body. He had woven his crime into the infrastructure of their lives. He had made them unwitting guardians of his secret. This was the true horror that the cold case podcasts and articles dissected, the intimacy of the violation. The monster wasn't in the dark woods. He was in the foundation of the town itself. Jim Miller, in his retirement, became a tragic figure in this retrospective narrative. He was the hero who solved the case, yes, but he refused to accept the title. To him, the 40-year cold case solved wasn't a victory, it was a salvage operation. He spent his days sitting on his porch, dissecting his own memories, looking for the moment he could have changed the outcome. He thought about the interview with Penhaligon in the first week. He remembered the man's calm demeanor, his grease-stained hands, his helpfulness. Jim realized that he had fallen victim to the normality bias. He hadn't suspected Penhaligon because Penhaligon didn't feel like a killer. He felt like a mechanic. He felt like a voter. He felt like Oakhaven. Jim realized that the greatest camouflage a predator has is not a mask, but a mundane routine. The man-moi ky la he had spent a lifetime looking for was the absence of anything strange at all. The killer was the man who waved hello. This realization dismantled Jim's faith in his own instincts. He died 2 years after Penhaligon, his obituary praising his persistence. But those who knew him knew that he died with a broken heart, burdened by the weight of the 40 years he couldn't give back to Sarah's parents. The legacy of the Miller case also changed the way missing persons cases were handled nationwide. It became a case study in the academy, a textbook failure that led to new protocols. The golden hour search grids were tightened. The reliance on eyewitness testimony, like the tan van, was deprioritized in favor of digital forensics and immediate canvas surveillance. The Sarah Miller protocol was established in the state, requiring that all cold case physical evidence be reevaluated every 5 years with the latest technology, preventing another lost decade from occurring. The tragedy of Oakhaven became a catalyst for a more rigorous, scientific approach to policing. The SOC Tsongdong was transformed into policy. The girl who had been forgotten by the system became the reason the system changed. It was a grim consolation prize, but it was the only one available. The Man-moi Bo NGO that had slipped through the cracks in 1984 will be caught by the nets of 2025. Yet, amidst the analysis of failures, there was also a recognition of the triumph of human persistence. The citizen detectives, the internet sleuths who had kept the flame alive in the dark years, were vindicated. They had been dismissed as ghouls and busybodies, but their obsession had kept the pressure on. The Archivist 84 user, who had first connected the dark sedan sightings across county lines, was revealed to be a retired librarian from Ohio who had never even been to Oakhaven. Her work, done for free in the quiet of her home, had laid the groundwork for the geographic profile that helped corner Penhaligon. This was the new reality of crime solving, a distributed network of justice that transcended jurisdiction and budget. The Matt Titchby was no longer the sole property of the police. It belonged to the crowd. The Miller case proved that while the internet could spread misinformation, like the Tanvan rumors, it could also harness the collective processing power of humanity to solve the insoluble. The cultural impact on Oakhaven was a shift from innocence to vigilance. The parents of the 2020s didn't raise their children the way the parents of the 1980s had. The free-range childhood, where a 12-year-old could ride her bike alone at twilight, was extinct. The bronze statue of Sarah Miller in the Memorial Park wasn't just a tribute. It was a boundary marker. It said, "This is where the world changed." The SOC had faded, but the scar tissue was tough and unyielding. The town was safer, statistically, than it had ever been, but it didn't feel safe. The shadow of the tan van, even though it was a myth, still loomed in the collective imagination. Neighbors watched each other a little more closely. Unmarked cars were noted. The community had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the most dangerous things are not the ones that go bump in the night, but the ones that go about their business in the broad daylight. As the dust of the excavation settled and the grass grew over the scar where the loading dock used to be, the cold case entered the realm of history. But history is not static. It changes depending on who is telling it. To the police, it was a success of forensic genealogy. To the town, it was a tragedy of betrayal. To the Miller family, it was simply an end to the waiting. The 40-year cold case solved was a headline that hid 1,000 smaller, more painful stories. It hid the story of the officer who missed the log. It hid the story of the neighbor who saw the sedan but didn't call in. It hid the story of Arthur Penhaligon's family, who had to change their names and move away, bearing the guilt of a crime they didn't commit. The ripples of October 12, 1984, had finally hit the shore, but they had changed the shoreline forever. The final analysis of the Sarah Miller case brings us back to the concept of time. Time was the weapon, the enemy, and ultimately the solution. It allowed the killer to hide, but it also allowed the science to catch him. It eroded the evidence, but it also eroded the killer's defenses. It broke the hearts of the parents, but it hardened the resolve of the detectives. The Matt Titchbian was a war of attrition. And while the good guys won in the end, the cost of the victory was 40 years of life that could never be reclaimed. The case proved that there is no such thing as a perfect crime, only a crime that hasn't been solved yet. It proved that the truth is patient. It will wait in a box, in a drop of spit, in a line of code, or in a concrete well for as long as it takes. The Manwa KY law is always there. It just requires the right eyes and the right time to see it. And so, we are left with the image of the spinning wheel, the symbol that started it all. In 1984, it represented a life interrupted. In 2025, it represents a cycle closed. The wheel has stopped. The momentum is gone. But the energy it generated, the grief, the fear, the anger, and the hope, has been transferred into the world, changing it in ways that are both visible and invisible. The Oak Haven case is closed, but the questions it raised about safety, community, and the fallibility of justice hang in the air like the mist off the Pacific, waiting for the next time the streetlights flicker and a child doesn't come home. The story is over, but the echo remains, a low-frequency hum that vibrates in the soul of anyone who knows the name Sarah Miller. The cameras have gone. The satellite trucks, which once formed a steel ring around the perimeter of the Oak Haven Memorial Park, have retracted their dishes and rolled away, chasing the next tragedy in the next town. The breaking news banners have faded from the screens, replaced by weather reports and sports scores. The digital frenzy of the cold case forums has quieted, the threads locked, the moderators moving on to newer mysteries. What remains, after the noise of justice has finally exhausted itself, is a silence that feels different from the silence of 1984. It is not the silence of a held breath, nor the silence of a secret kept in the dark. It is the silence of a church after the service has ended, a heavy, consecrated stillness where the air itself seems to be waiting for permission to move again. The Matt Titchbian, the mysterious disappearance, is no longer a headline. It is no longer a police file number. It has returned to what it was always meant to be, a story about a girl who didn't come home, and the town that finally learned how to say goodbye. In the center of the park, where the loading dock of the Sears department store once stood, the bronze statue of Sarah Miller captures the last moment of her innocence. The artist was careful. They didn't sculpt a victim. They didn't sculpt a symbol of the SOC, Songdong, the community shock. They sculpted a 12-year-old girl. She is frozen mid-petal, her hair blowing back as if caught in an invisible wind, her mouth open in a half-smile, perhaps humming a song that was popular in October 1984. To the casual observer, it is a beautiful piece of public art. To the people of Oak Haven, it is a resurrection. It is an act of defiance against Arthur Penhaligon. He tried to erase her. He tried to turn her into a void beneath a concrete slab. But in the end, the town raised her up in metal and stone, ensuring that she would stand in the light forever, long after his name has rotted into obscurity. The Manwa KY La. The strange clues are gone, replaced by this permanent, unyielding testament to existence. Reclaiming Sarah's identity from the cold case, label was the final, and perhaps hardest, task. For 40 years, she had been defined by her death. She was the body in the well. She was the girl in the van. She was a collection of evidence bags and autopsy reports. But as the town began to heal, stories began to surface that had nothing to do with the crime. Old classmates, now grandparents themselves, started sharing memories that had been suppressed by the trauma. They talked about how Sarah was the only one who could do a cartwheel on a balance beam. They talked about her obsession with horses and how she used to draw them on the margins of her math homework. They talked about the gap in her teeth that she was self-conscious about, the very gap that is now immortalized in bronze. These weren't memoir, clues for a detective. They were fragments of a soul. The "d'où and quoi vieux on," the echoes of the crime, began to be drowned out by the echoes of her life. The narrative shifted from who killed her to who is she, and in that shift, the town found its salvation. Jim Miller didn't live long enough to see the first spring bloom in the memorial garden. He passed away quietly in his sleep 6 months after the statue was unveiled, his work on this earth emphatically done. They found him in his armchair, a paperback Western on his lap, his face relaxed in a way it hadn't been since 1984. There were no files on his table, no maps of the woods, no photos of the man moi beau ngo, the open-ended clues. He had cleared the decks. His funeral was attended by half the town, including Sarah Chun, who placed a single white rose on his coffin. In his eulogy, the pastor didn't speak of the detective who caught a killer. He spoke of the shepherd who refused to leave the one lost sheep behind. Jim Miller was the bridge between the past and the present, the man who carried the torch through the lost decades when everyone else wanted to let the fire go out. He is buried in the plot next to his wife. But in the mythology of Oakhaven, his spirit is standing guard at the memorial park, watching over the bronze girl, ensuring that no shadows ever touch her again. The psychological landscape of Oakhaven has changed, reshaped by the 40-year cold case, solved resolution. The parents of today walk through the park with their children, and they stop at the statue. They don't use it to scare their kids. They don't tell the story of the man in the tan van anymore. They tell the story of the girl who was found. They tell the story of the blue thread and the DNA, explaining that the truth is powerful, that science is a light in the dark, and that no matter how long it takes, the world will come looking for you. The SOC of the tragedy has metabolized into a quiet vigilance. The community is tighter now, bound not by fear, but by shared history. They know what lies beneath the surface of their town, both the literal concrete and the metaphorical secrets, and they have chosen to live there anyway. They have chosen to reclaim the ground. The mall is gone, and with it, the temple of consumerism that masked the grave. In its place is a temple of memory, a green space where life continues, where teenagers play frisbee and couples have picnics, their laughter rising into the air, mingling with the memory of the girl who never got to grow up. As the sun begins to set on a crisp November evening in 2026, the park is bathed in a golden amber light, the same quality of light that bathed the cul-de-sac 42 years ago. The cycle of the seasons continues, indifferent to human tragedy. The leaves on the oak trees turn the color of fire, then brown, then fall, covering the ground in a rustling carpet. A young girl, perhaps 12 years old, rides her bicycle through the park. She has a helmet on, a concession to the modern era, but her bike is chrome, and it glimmers in the twilight. She rides past the statue, slowing down for a brief moment to look at the bronze face. There's a recognition there, a silent communication between the living and the frozen. The girl on the bike doesn't know the horror of the Matt Titchbian. She doesn't know about the irrigation well or the cement cap. She just sees a girl like her. She pedals on, the sound of her wheels spinning. Horror, 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 a sound that is no longer a harbinger of doom, but a rhythm of life moving forward. The legacy of Sarah Miller is not the crime. It is the persistence of love. It is the fact that her father never changed his phone number, just in case. It is the fact that a detective spent his retirement staring at a blue thread. It is the fact that a geneticist in a lab 3 states away cried when she saw the DNA match. Evil, embodied by Arthur Penhaligon, is solitary. It is selfish. It consumes and destroys and leaves nothing behind but ash. But love is collective. It builds. It connects. It spans 40 years and refuses to let go. The cold case proved that evil can hide for a long time, masked by the mundane, protected by the man-moi ky law of normalcy, but also proved that love is patient enough to outwait it. Penhaligon died alone in a cage, his name spoken with disgust. Sarah lives on in the center of the town, surrounded by white roses, her name spoken with tenderness. In the final accounting of the universe, that is the only verdict that matters. As night fully descends, The solar-powered lights around the statue flicker on. They cast a soft, halo-like glow around the bronze figure, pushing back the shadows of the Oakhaven night. The wind picks up, rustling the dry leaves, creating a sound like 1,000 whispering voices. If you listen closely, underneath the noise of the wind and the distant traffic, you can almost hear it. Not the scream, not the siren, but the laughter. A faint, distant sound of a child enjoying a bike ride on a Tuesday evening. The "do and qua vu" on has finally faded, leaving only the pure, uncorrupted memory of the person. The mystery is over. The files are burned. The evidence is archived. The story has been told. And so, the town of Oakhaven sleeps. The windows are dark. The doors are locked, but the fear is gone. The monster has been exorcised from the soil. The man in the tan van is a ghost that has been busted by the light of truth. In the memorial park, the bronze wheel of the bicycle stays fixed in place, grounded and secure, never to spin into the darkness again. The journey is done. Sarah Miller is home. The 40-year cold case is solved, not just by the law, but by the heart. The silence that holds the town now is a peaceful one, a silence that says, "We remember. We know. We are still here." The screen fades to black, but the light on the statue remains, a single, unblinking star in the center of the world, shining on and on and on. End of script.